Jason Nelson didn't lower his voice when he fired his own wife. In front of board members, investors, and executives gathered to celebrate a billion-dollar acquisition, he called Allison Nelson the company's biggest obstacle and ordered security to escort her out. No one questioned him. No one noticed Allison quietly placing one slim folder into her briefcase before walking away without a single word. They believed the deal was finally free to move forward. They were wrong. The only signature capable of turning the acquisition into a legally binding agreement had just walked out of the room with the woman Jason had publicly humiliated. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If you believe integrity matters more than power, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next story where quiet strength speaks louder than revenge. On the 32nd floor of Nelson Dynamics headquarters overlooking Manhattan, Allison Nelson occupied the quietest office on the executive level. It had no panoramic corner windows, no expensive artwork chosen to impress visitors, and no oversized desk meant to symbolize authority. Instead, every shelf held neatly organized binders, every drawer contained carefully labeled files, and every calendar on the wall was filled with handwritten notes rather than colorful decorations. She preferred order over appearance. For nearly 12 years, Allison had served as the company's General Counsel. Every merger, every acquisition, every major contract that carried the company's name had passed across her desk before reaching anyone else's. Employees joked that if a document survived Allison's review, it could survive anything. She never laughed at the joke. To Allison, contracts were not obstacles. They were promises. Every paragraph existed because someone somewhere had once ignored a detail that later destroyed lives, companies, or families. That philosophy had quietly become the legal foundation upon which Nelson Dynamics expanded from a modest engineering startup into one of America's fastest-growing technology corporations. Yet, very few people inside the company remembered that history anymore. Most employees knew only one face: Jason Nelson. Tall, charismatic, confident in every interview and every shareholder presentation, Jason had become the public symbol of Nelson Dynamics. Business magazines praised his bold leadership. Financial television networks invited him to discuss innovation and market strategy. Young entrepreneurs quoted his speeches on social media as examples of fearless ambition. He had learned to command attention the moment he entered any room, and after years of applause, he had gradually begun believing that success followed his instincts alone. The cameras never showed Allison sitting several seats away during those interviews. She preferred it that way, when reporters requested photographs of the executive team. Allison often positioned herself near the edge of the group, allowing others to stand in the center. She never corrected journalists who assumed someone else handled the company's legal affairs. Recognition had never interested her. Responsibility had. Years earlier, before Nelson Dynamics occupied an entire skyscraper floor, Jason and Allison had worked from a rented office above an old warehouse in Brooklyn. The company had only 7 employees then. Jason sold ambitious ideas. Allison protected those ideas from becoming expensive mistakes. He attracted investors. She reviewed every investment agreement. He convinced clients. She ensured every promise could legally be fulfilled. Friends often described them as perfectly balanced. Jason was movement. Allison was stability. Neither quality alone would have built the company they eventually created together. During those early years, their marriage reflected the same partnership. Late nights often ended with takeout containers scattered across conference tables while they debated legal language, financial forecasts, and hiring decisions. Jason dreamed aloud about future expansion. Allison listened patiently before pointing out overlooked risks. Sometimes, Jason became frustrated. Almost every time weeks later, he admitted she had been right. Those conversations gradually became part of their rhythm. Not arguments, corrections, adjustments, trust. Then success arrived faster than either of them expected. The first $100 million transformed the company. The first billion transformed Jason. Success brought larger investors, larger offices, private flights, international conferences, and an executive team that admired confidence far more than caution. Among the newest executives was Michael Brooks. Michael had joined Nelson Dynamics as Chief Operating Officer 3 years earlier, after building a reputation for accelerating corporate growth. Intelligent, polished, and relentlessly ambitious, he understood something many executives overlooked. A CEO, under constant praise, becomes increasingly vulnerable to people who reinforce his confidence. Michael rarely disagreed with Jason during meetings. Instead, he praised every ambitious proposal before quietly identifying whoever appeared to be slowing progress. More often than not, that person became Allison. Legal always needs another week. Compliance is asking more questions. We're losing momentum. They're overthinking simple decisions. The criticism was never personal on the surface. It didn't need to be. Repeated often enough, small doubts become accepted truths. Jason never noticed how frequently Michael redirected frustration toward Allison. Allison noticed immediately. She simply wrote another note in another notebook. Across the hallway worked Rebecca Hayes, the company's chief financial officer. Unlike Michael, Rebecca believed numbers had no loyalty. Financial statements revealed whatever people attempted to hide. She respected Allison because they shared the same habit. Neither woman rushed important decisions. Neither woman enjoyed unnecessary conflict. Several times during executive meetings, Rebecca caught Allison making small, handwritten notes beside financial reports instead of speaking. Afterward, Rebecca occasionally asked, "Did you find something?" Allison's answer was usually the same. "I'm still confirming." She never accused anyone before collecting evidence, never reached conclusions before examining every document, never allowed emotion to replace proof. That discipline earned respect from attorneys throughout the industry. It also made impatient executives uncomfortable. Outside the company, another important figure had entered the story. Ethan Walker, a senior corporate attorney representing the International Investment Consortium preparing to acquire one of Nelson Dynamics' largest competitors. The proposed acquisition carried a value exceeding $1 billion. Financial media already called it one of the year's defining business deals. If completed successfully, Nelson Dynamics would instantly become one of the dominant companies in its sector. Investors celebrated. Analysts predicted explosive growth. Employees expected bonuses. Jason viewed the acquisition as the achievement that would permanently secure his legacy. But inside Allison's office, celebration never arrived. Instead, stacks of documents continued growing higher. Every morning, she reviewed another section of disclosure reports. Every afternoon, she compared financial statements. Every evening, she highlighted provisions requiring clarification. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, simply careful work. Margaret Collins, the chairwoman of the board, occasionally stopped by Allison's office without scheduling an appointment. Margaret had practiced corporate law decades before entering executive leadership. She understood something many directors forgot. Major companies rarely collapse because of dramatic scandals at first. They collapse because someone ignores small warnings until they become catastrophic. One afternoon, Margaret noticed Allison studying the same agreement for nearly an hour. "You've read that section 3 times. "I have." "Still uncertain?" Allison looked up calmly. "I'm certain enough to keep reading." Margaret smiled slightly. It was exactly the answer she expected. She left without asking another question. Trust, she believed, often sounded remarkably quiet. Meanwhile, Jason's schedule looked entirely different. Investor dinners, television interviews, conference speeches, strategy sessions, international conference calls. His calendar measured success by visibility. Allison measured success by what never became tomorrow's lawsuit. The difference between those perspectives had once strengthened their marriage. Now it slowly widened the distance between them. Even at home, conversations became shorter. Jason discussed expansion targets. Allison asked questions about regulatory approval. Jason talked about deadlines. Allison mentioned unresolved liabilities. He interpreted caution as resistance. She interpreted urgency as unnecessary risk. Neither realized how completely they had stopped hearing one another. Late one evening, after most employees had gone home, Allison remained alone, reviewing one final collection of acquisition documents. Outside her office window, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of lights. Inside, only the soft hum of fluorescent fixtures accompanied the turning of another page. She paused. One paragraph, one financial disclosure, one cross-reference. Nothing appeared obviously illegal. Yet something felt incomplete. She reached for another binder, then another. She opened archived correspondence dating back several months and began comparing language between early drafts and current versions. A small difference. Only 2 rewritten sentences. Most readers would never notice. Most attorneys might overlook them. Allison didn't. She circled both paragraphs with a blue pen. Then she opened her notebook and carefully wrote the date, the document number, and the exact page where the language had changed. No accusations, no conclusions, just facts. She closed the notebook before turning off her office light. As she walked through the silent hallway, dozens of framed photographs celebrated the company's remarkable rise. Jason stood smiling in almost every picture. Allison appeared in only a few. She never minded. Photographs preserved recognition. Records preserved truth. And although no one inside Nelson Dynamics understood it, yet the future of the billion-dollar acquisition would depend far less on the smiling faces hanging along those polished walls than on the quiet woman carrying a notebook toward the elevator. Because before anyone could celebrate the biggest deal in the company's history, Allison intended to verify every final detail. She had no intention of stopping the acquisition. She intended to make sure the company survived it. The first signs of pressure did not arrive as shouting matches or emergency meetings. They arrived as calendars that grew too full. Every morning, Jason Nelson walked into conference rooms where investors wanted updates measured in hours rather than weeks. Analysts demanded certainty. Financial institutions expected signatures. Investment banks prepared press releases before the final documents had even been approved. Every conversation ended with the same question: when do we close? Jason answered with increasing confidence: soon. That single word became both a promise and a burden. At first he believed it. Then he needed to believe it. Across the city, newspapers and business websites praised Nelson Dynamics almost daily. Headlines predicted that the acquisition would redefine competition in the technology sector. Television commentators described Jason as the executive willing to make bold decisions, while competitors hesitated. Jason rarely corrected them. Recognition had become addictive. Every compliment reinforced the belief that hesitation was the greatest enemy of success. Inside executive meetings, however, the atmosphere felt different. The boardroom overlooked the Hudson River, but few people noticed the view anymore. Every chair was occupied by department heads balancing laptops, reports, and projections. The room buzzed with restrained urgency. Michael Brooks stood near the presentation screen, reviewing another timeline. "If legal signs off this week," he said confidently, Integration begins immediately. Jason nodded. What about outstanding issues? Michael clicked to the next slide. Operations are ready. Another slide. Technology migration is ready. Another. Human resources is ready. Then he paused. The only remaining delay comes from legal. He did not mention Allison by name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room drifted toward her. Allison remained composed. She looked down at the printed agenda before lifting a single document from her folder. There are still unresolved disclosure questions. Jason leaned back. How many? 23. Someone near the end of the table sighed. Michael spoke before anyone else could. Weren't there 31 yesterday? There were. So progress is being made. Yes. Then why not finish the remaining questions after closing? Allison answered without changing her tone. Because once we close, they become our liabilities. Silence settled across the room. Jason rubbed his forehead. We're talking about technical disclosures. We're talking about legal responsibility. Michael folded his arms. The seller has already assured us the information is complete. Allison looked toward him. I've learned not to confuse assurance with evidence. The sentence wasn't hostile. It was factual. Unfortunately, facts often frustrated people who wanted momentum. Jason closed the discussion. Let's move on. The meeting continued, but something had changed. Several executives now viewed Allison not as the person protecting the company, but as the person slowing everyone else's work. Michael noticed their expressions, exactly as he hoped. Over the following week, Jason's schedule became increasingly demanding. Private equity representatives requested emergency calls. Investment banks wanted confirmation before preparing financing documents. Marketing executives developed campaigns announcing the historic acquisition. Every department behaved as though the deal had already been completed. Only legal continued asking questions. Jason stopped visiting Allison's office. Instead, he relied on updates from Michael. It happened gradually. Michael never lied outright. He simply summarized situations in ways that emphasized delay instead of reason. Legal wants more documents. Legal isn't comfortable yet. Legal found another issue. Each statement was technically accurate. None explained why. Jason rarely asked. His attention had shifted toward deadlines. Meanwhile, Allison spent nearly every evening inside the secure legal archive. Boxes of historical contracts lined metal shelves. Digital records filled encrypted servers. Most employees assumed she was reviewing ordinary compliance documents. Only Allison understood the pattern beginning to emerge. One night, she spread dozens of financial schedules across the conference table. The acquisition involved hundreds of subsidiary companies. Most appeared legitimate. Some existed only on paper. She traced ownership structures with colored markers: blue, green, yellow. One company transferred money to another, then another. Eventually, several transactions returned to organizations connected to the original seller. Perfectly legal, at least on the surface. She frowned. Money usually moved for reasons. The question wasn't whether the transactions existed. The question was why. She opened another folder, then another. Hours disappeared unnoticed. Rebecca Hayes found Allison still working after 9 o'clock. I thought everyone had gone home. They probably have. Rebecca set a coffee cup beside Allison. You've been staring at those records all day. I'm comparing reporting periods. Rebecca glanced across the documents. Find anything? I'm finding inconsistencies. Illegal. I don't know. Rebecca appreciated that answer. Too many executives reached conclusions first and searched for supporting evidence afterwards. Allison worked the opposite way. Evidence first, conclusions last. Rebecca pulled out a chair. "Show me." For the next hour, they quietly reviewed spreadsheets together. Rebecca pointed toward one transfer. "This payment appears twice." "It does. But under different descriptions." "Exactly." Rebecca examined another page. "And this consulting company?" "It received payments without corresponding invoices." Rebecca slowly leaned back. "That's unusual." "Yes, but not enough." Rebecca understood immediately. Not enough for accusations, not enough for legal action, not enough to stop a billion-dollar acquisition. Yet, "We need more." Allison nodded. "We always need more." Across town, Jason attended a dinner hosted by several institutional investors. Crystal glasses reflected city lights. Expensive wine circulated freely. Everyone congratulated him. "This acquisition changes everything. You'll double market share. The board must be thrilled." Jason smiled confidently. "They are." He wanted to believe the sentence. One investor asked casually, "Any remaining obstacles?" Jason hesitated only briefly. "Just routine legal review." The investor laughed. "Lawyers always worry." Everyone around the table smiled. Jason smiled too. But somewhere inside, the joke remained with him longer than expected. The following morning, Michael stopped by Jason's office carrying several folders. "I prepared revised timelines." Jason accepted them. "How much longer?" "If Allison cooperates." Jason looked up. "What do you mean?" Michael chose his words carefully. "I think she's become overly cautious." "She's always been cautious." "Not like this." Jason remained silent. Michael continued. "I respect her." Another calculated pause. "But we're risking the entire acquisition because she refuses to move forward." Jason stared through the glass wall overlooking the executive floor. Employees hurried between offices carrying laptops and binders. Everything depended upon momentum. Momentum depended upon confidence. Confidence depended upon leadership. Michael quietly added one final sentence. "Sometimes, even good people become obstacles." The words lingered after Michael left. Jason had heard similar thoughts before. From investors, from consultants, from department heads, now from his COO. Each conversation alone meant little. Together they began forming certainty. Later that afternoon, Allison requested 15 minutes with Jason. He agreed. She entered carrying 3 binders and 1 legal notebook. Jason noticed immediately. "No presentations. I only need documents." She placed the binders on his desk. "I've identified additional disclosure issues." Jason sighed. "How serious?" "I don't know yet." "You've been saying that for weeks." "Because I'm still verifying." Jason stood and walked toward the window. "We can't investigate forever." "I'm not asking forever." "Then how long?" "I need enough time to know whether the company is assuming undisclosed liabilities." Jason turned around. "Every acquisition carries risk." "Yes. But informed risk differs from hidden risk." Jason folded his arms. "Michael believes we're becoming too conservative." Allison remained quiet. After several seconds, she asked gently, "Is that what you believe?" Jason didn't answer immediately. He wanted to say no. Instead, another sentence emerged. "I think we're losing valuable time." Allison looked at him carefully, not with anger, not disappointment, with concern. The law doesn't reward speed. It also doesn't reward hesitation. No, she nodded. It rewards diligence. The room became silent. Years earlier, that sentence would have ended the discussion. Jason would have trusted her judgment. Today, he looked unconvinced. Allison recognized the difference. She closed the binders. I'll continue reviewing. Jason didn't stop her. That evening, Allison remained alone once again. She reopened archived email correspondence connected to the acquisition. Most messages contained ordinary negotiations, price adjustments, scheduling, contract revisions. Nothing unusual. Then one email chain caught her attention. A document attachment referenced during earlier discussions no longer appeared in the current records. She searched the archive. Nothing. She searched again. Still nothing. The attachment had existed. Now it was missing. Accidental deletion, administrative oversight, or deliberate removal. She made another handwritten note. Date, time, sender, recipient. Missing attachment. No assumptions. Only facts. She closed her notebook. Outside, the city continued celebrating another successful business day. Inside, Nelson Dynamics executives believed the only remaining challenge involved obtaining Allison's approval. They couldn't see what she had begun to uncover. And Allison herself still didn't know exactly what the missing pieces would reveal. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty. The closer she looked, the more carefully someone appeared to have hidden the truth. Fan 4. Monday began with rain sweeping across Manhattan, turning the windows of Nelson Dynamics into long sheets of silver. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying umbrellas and coffee cups, exchanging optimistic greetings about the week that everyone believed would end with the company's historic acquisition. Only one person entered the building without looking toward the large digital display in the lobby, counting down to closing day. Allison Nelson walked directly to the legal department with a leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm. She had spent most of the weekend reviewing documents at home. Not because she enjoyed working on weekends, because something refused to fit. Experienced attorneys often described intuition as a dangerous substitute for evidence. Allison agreed. She never trusted intuition by itself. But she had learned to respect it as an invitation to keep looking. Her instincts were telling her there was still a missing piece. She intended to find it. At 8:30, the executive leadership team gathered for another acquisition briefing. Jason entered with the confident pace employees had come to associate with decisive leadership. Michael Brooks was already organizing presentation slides. Rebecca Hayes quietly reviewed financial summaries. Margaret Collins sat at the far end of the table reading printed reports instead of watching the presentation screen. Allison arrived precisely on time. She carried 3 binders, nothing more. Jason opened the meeting. We're 1 week away from closing. His voice carried the excitement expected from a CEO standing on the edge of the biggest achievement of his career. I want every department prepared to execute immediately after signatures are complete. Michael smiled. Operations are ready. Rebecca spoke next. Financing remains secure. Information technology confirmed migration schedules. Human resources confirmed integration plans. Every report sounded positive. Every department declared itself ready. Finally, Jason looked toward Allison. Legal. She opened the first binder. I cannot recommend closing on the current timeline. The atmosphere changed immediately. Jason's expression hardened. Explain. There are unresolved discrepancies involving several intermediary entities connected to the seller. Michael leaned forward. We've already discussed those. We discussed them. Allison nodded calmly. We haven't resolved them. Jason folded his hands together. What exactly are you missing? I'm requesting complete transaction histories for 6 affiliated companies. Michael answered before anyone else. Those companies aren't material to the acquisition. Allison looked directly at him. They become material if they conceal liabilities. Michael smiled politely. That's speculation. No. She shook her head. Speculation is assuming everything is fine without reviewing the records. Silence settled across the room. Jason broke it. How much additional time? I don't know. Jason frowned. You don't know? I'll know after reviewing the records. We don't have unlimited time. I'm not asking for unlimited time. She paused. I'm asking for complete information. Jason exhaled slowly. We've invested months preparing this transaction. And months deserve one more week if necessary. Michael gently tapped his pen. 1 week becomes 2. 2 becomes 4. The market won't wait forever. Allison didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice remained as steady as ever. The law doesn't care about market impatience. Jason looked away. For the first time in years, he found himself irritated by the sentence, instead of reassured. After the meeting ended, executives dispersed in uneasy silence. Rebecca caught up with Allison in the hallway. Do you really think something serious is hidden? I think something hasn't been explained. Same answer. It's the only honest one. Rebecca nodded. I've been reviewing cash movements. And there are transfers I still can't explain. Allison stopped walking. Show me. Half an hour later, they sat together inside Rebecca's office. Large financial reports covered the conference table. Rebecca highlighted several transactions. These payments were routed through consulting firms. Allison studied the entries. Same dates? Mostly. Supporting invoices? Rebecca shook her head. None. What explanations were provided? Strategic advisory services. Allison raised an eyebrow. That's unusually vague. Rebecca quietly agreed. Too vague. Together, they traced payments moving from one company to another before disappearing into organizations with almost identical ownership structures. Nothing openly illegal, nothing impossible to justify. Yet everything felt unnecessarily complicated. Complexity often existed for legitimate reasons. Sometimes it existed because someone wanted fewer people asking questions. Allison circled another company name. This entity appears repeatedly. Rebecca looked closer. It wasn't included in the original acquisition summary. It should have been. Rebecca leaned back. You think someone intentionally excluded it? I don't know. The answer frustrated Rebecca, not because it lacked intelligence, because Allison refused to speculate, even when evidence pointed in one direction. She insisted on certainty. Always. That afternoon, Allison sent another formal legal request to Ethan Walker. The email was concise, professional, specific. She requested complete banking documentation, ownership disclosures, and supporting records for 6 affiliated corporations. Within an hour, Ethan replied. The response surprised her. The requested documents would require approval from additional representatives before release. That had never happened before. Allison reread the email twice. Then once more. The wording wasn't hostile. It was cautious, unusually cautious. She made another note. Unexpected resistance. Not proof, just observation. Meanwhile, Jason's office welcomed another group of investors. The mood remained optimistic. Presentation slides projected revenue growth. Analysts discussed market expansion. One investor asked a familiar question. When do we announce the acquisition publicly? Jason smiled. As soon as legal gives final clearance. The investor laughed lightly. I suppose lawyers earn their salaries by delaying celebrations. Everyone around the table chuckled. Jason forced himself to smile. The joke no longer amused him. Instead, he remembered Allison's repeated requests. Another week, another review, another unanswered question. As the meeting ended, Michael remained behind. You handled that well. Jason loosened his tie. I'm tired of explaining delays. They're becoming harder to justify. Jason nodded. Michael lowered his voice. I've spoken with several department heads. And they're beginning to lose confidence. In me? No, Michael answered carefully. In legal. Jason looked thoughtful. They think Allison is being unreasonable. Michael hesitated just long enough to appear reluctant. I didn't want to say it. Jason stared through the office windows overlooking Manhattan. Far below, traffic moved with predictable order. Everything in business depended upon movement, momentum, timing, speed. Legal caution suddenly felt like an anchor. The thought unsettled him, because years earlier he would never have described Allison that way. Late that evening, Allison finally received additional financial files. She remained alone in the legal department while cleaning crews worked quietly throughout the building. She opened the first folder, then another, then another. Hours passed unnoticed. The requested records answered several questions. They also created entirely new ones. One payment appeared legitimate until compared against bank statements from another subsidiary. The dates matched. The amounts matched. The recipient did not. She checked again, then compared electronic records against printed disclosures. Different names, same account numbers. That should have been impossible. Unless... She stopped herself. No conclusions. Verify first. She logged into the company's secure financial archive. Searching historical records required multiple authentication steps. She patiently completed each one. Minutes later, another collection of archived statements appeared. She compared every line. One transfer, another, then a third. Each had been divided into smaller payments, moving through separate companies before arriving at identical destinations. Layering, not necessarily illegal, but certainly unusual. She opened her notebook. Date, account number, reference code, supporting document. Everything carefully recorded. The notebook had become thicker over the past month. Every page contained observations. None contained accusations. The following morning, Allison requested a private meeting with Jason. He agreed reluctantly. She entered carrying only one folder. I need authorization. For what? Expanded forensic accounting review. Jason stared at her. You're asking for forensic accountants? Yes. Before closing? Yes. Jason stood slowly. Do you realize what message that sends? I do. It tells investors we don't trust the seller. It tells investors we trust verification. Jason walked around his desk. We've already spent millions on due diligence. And due diligence isn't complete. Jason's patience finally began wearing thin. Every time we answer one question, you ask 3 more. Because each answer creates additional inconsistencies, or because you're refusing to let this transaction move forward. The words hung heavily between them. For several seconds, Allison simply looked at him. Not offended, not angry, almost saddened. I've never refused to move forward. She spoke quietly. I've refused to move blindly. Jason crossed his arms. You're asking me to postpone the biggest opportunity this company has ever had. I'm asking you to protect it. He shook his head. Sometimes I think you only see risk, Allison answered with complete sincerity. That's my job. Jason didn't respond. He couldn't, because once many years earlier he had admired exactly that answer. Now it sounded like resistance. Allison realized the conversation had reached its limit. She closed the folder. I'll continue my review. As she walked toward the door, Jason spoke without turning around. Allison. She paused. We're running out of time. She looked back at him. So as whoever hoped no one would notice. Jason frowned. What does that mean? It means I'm getting closer. She left before explaining further. Jason remained standing alone inside his office. Outside the glass walls, employees hurried through another busy morning preparing for a billion-dollar celebration. None of them realized the celebration had already begun slipping further away, and none of them yet understood that the woman everyone blamed for delaying the deal was quietly uncovering the evidence that could determine whether Nelson Dynamics would become stronger or collapse under liabilities no one else had bothered to see. The email arrived in Allison Nelson's inbox at exactly 7:12 on Wednesday morning. Mandatory executive leadership meeting, attendance required. 10:00 a.m. executive boardroom. No agenda, no explanation. Only Jason's name at the bottom. Allison read the message once before closing her laptop. She did not immediately begin guessing its purpose. She had long ago learned that assumptions wasted energy better spent preparing for facts. Still, experience had taught her something else. Meetings without agendas were rarely called to exchange information. They were usually called because someone had already made a decision. By 8 o'clock, the executive floor felt different. Conversations stopped when people passed one another in the hallway. Assistants whispered more than usual. Several department heads looked toward the boardroom each time they walked by. Rumors traveled quickly inside successful companies. No one knew exactly what would happen. Everyone believed something significant was about to. Michael Brooks moved confidently from office to office, checking schedules and quietly speaking with senior managers. His expression revealed nothing, but his calmness carried the unmistakable confidence of a man who believed events were unfolding according to plan. Rebecca Hayes noticed. She also noticed Jason's office door remained closed all morning. That almost never happened before important meetings. Inside his office, Jason stood beside the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beneath him. Traffic flowed with mechanical precision. Construction cranes dotted the skyline. Everything outside appeared to move forward. Inside his mind, however, progress felt increasingly trapped. Investor pressure had intensified again the previous evening. The lead financing bank wanted confirmation before Friday. International partners requested updated schedules. Analysts had begun questioning why the acquisition still lacked final approval. Each conversation ended exactly the same way. We need certainty. Jason wanted certainty too. Instead, every update from legal contained another unanswered question. He heard a knock. Come in. Michael entered carrying a slim folder. I've summarized departmental feedback. Jason accepted it. Most comments sounded predictable. Operations was ready. Technology was ready. Marketing was ready. Human resources was ready. Then came the final section, legal. Michael had summarized recent concerns, repeated delays, additional document requests, expanded investigations, forensic accounting recommendation. Jason closed the folder. Have you spoken with Margaret? This morning. And she still believes Allison should complete her review. Jason sighed. Of course she does. Michael hesitated. I understand why Margaret feels that way. Jason looked at him. But leadership also means knowing when perfection becomes the enemy of progress. The sentence lingered. Jason didn't answer. Not because he agreed completely, because he no longer knew where caution ended and unnecessary delay began. Across the hallway, Allison unlocked a secure filing cabinet. Inside sat every original legal notebook she had maintained throughout the acquisition. Each notebook contained dated observations, meeting summaries, document references, questions, responses. Nothing dramatic, simply an organized chronology of facts. She removed 3 notebooks and placed them inside her leather briefcase. Next came printed email chains, then financial schedules, then disclosure requests. Finally, she copied every active acquisition file onto encrypted storage authorized under company policy for legal record preservation. The process took nearly 40 minutes. When she finished, everything remained exactly where it belonged. Nothing had been removed from company systems. Nothing had been altered. She had merely ensured that complete legal records existed exactly as required by professional ethics. She locked the cabinet, then wrote one final note inside her personal notebook. 096 a.m. All current legal records preserved. She closed the notebook. There was something quietly final about the gesture. At 9:30, Rebecca appeared at Allison's doorway. You have a minute? Always. Rebecca stepped inside. You've seen the meeting invitation? I have. What do you think this is about? I don't know. Rebecca smiled weakly. You always say that. Because it's true. Rebecca hesitated. I've been hearing things. Allison waited. Some executives think you're holding the company hostage. The words hung between them. Allison neither defended herself nor appeared offended. Instead, she asked one question. Do you think that? Rebecca answered immediately. No. Why not? Because every number you've questioned eventually needed another explanation. Allison nodded gratefully. Thank you. Rebecca looked toward the folders stacked neatly on Allison's desk. You've been preparing. I've been organizing. For what? For whatever today's meeting requires. Rebecca studied Allison carefully. Most people prepared for confrontation by rehearsing arguments. Allison prepared by organizing evidence. That difference had always impressed her. It also worried her, because only someone expecting serious consequences worked with such quiet precision. At 9:55, the boardroom slowly filled. Department heads entered first, then outside counsel, then representatives from the investment consortium. Ethan Walker greeted several executives before taking his seat. Margaret Collins entered carrying a yellow legal pad instead of a laptop. She noticed Allison immediately. 3 binders, 1 notebook, nothing unusual. Yet something about Allison's expression felt different. Not frightened, resolved. Jason entered exactly at 10. The room fell silent. He remained standing instead of taking his chair. Thank you for coming. His voice sounded measured, professional, almost rehearsed. We're approaching the most important transaction in our company's history. Heads nodded around the table. Every executive has worked tirelessly to reach this point. Another pause. Unfortunately, the single word instantly changed the atmosphere. Our progress has been repeatedly delayed. Jason looked directly toward Allison. No one else spoke. He continued, Our investors deserve confidence. Our employees deserve clarity. Our shareholders deserve leadership. Each sentence landed with increasing weight. Michael remained perfectly still. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Margaret watched Jason without interruption. Allison simply listened. Jason folded his hands. Over the past several weeks, our legal department has continued expanding review requirements beyond reasonable expectations. No names yet, only titles. But everyone understood. He continued. Deadlines have been missed. Confidence has been damaged. Critical opportunities have been placed at unnecessary risk. Still, Allison remained silent. Her notebook stayed closed. She reached for nothing, offered no interruption. The silence somehow made Jason continue longer than he originally intended. I have a responsibility to protect this company's future. Another pause. I cannot allow one department to prevent an entire organization from moving forward. The room had become perfectly still. Even the air conditioning seemed louder. Margaret finally spoke. Jason. He turned toward her. Has legal been allowed to complete its review? Jason answered carefully. They've had months. Margaret asked another question. Has every requested document been produced? Michael answered instead. We've provided substantial documentation. Margaret looked directly at him. I didn't ask about substantial. She turned back toward Jason. I asked whether every requested document has been produced. Jason hesitated. No. Margaret wrote something on her yellow pad. She said nothing further. The silence unsettled several people around the table. Jason continued the meeting by announcing revised closing objectives. Several department heads presented updated timelines. Yet the atmosphere never recovered. Everyone sensed another announcement remained waiting. When presentations concluded, Jason closed his folder. There will be organizational changes effective immediately. A few executives shifted uneasily. Jason continued. Leadership requires alignment. No one moved. My expectation is simple. He paused. Every executive must support the company's strategic direction. His eyes settled briefly on Allison, then moved away again. Not one person in the room failed to notice. The meeting adjourned just before noon. Executives filed quietly into the hallway. Conversations remained unusually restrained. Rebecca caught up with Margaret near the elevators. What do you think? Margaret answered without slowing her pace. I think someone is confusing urgency with wisdom. Rebecca glanced back toward the boardroom doors. You believe Allison? Margaret stopped walking. I believe evidence. Then she entered the elevator. Allison returned to her office. The floor seemed strangely quiet. She placed the 3 binders neatly beside her desk, checked each document one final time, locked the encrypted storage device inside her briefcase, then opened her email. A new message had just arrived. From Jason Nelson, subject private meeting 2:00 p.m. She read it once, closed the message, looked toward the Manhattan skyline beyond her office window. Somewhere below, the millions of people hurried through ordinary afternoons, unaware that lives could change completely between one meeting and the next. Allison slowly picked up her notebook. She wrote another single line, prepare only the truth. Then she closed the cover. She had no intention of arguing, no intention of pleading, no intention of defending herself. Whatever waited behind Jason's office door that afternoon, she would meet it exactly the same way she had approached every legal challenge throughout her career. With preparation, with patience, and with facts. Neither she nor anyone else on the executive floor realized that within a few hours, the balance of power inside Nelson Dynamics would change forever. At precisely 2:00 that afternoon, Allison Nelson knocked once on Jason Nelson's office door. Come in, His voice sounded calm, too calm. When Allison stepped inside, she immediately noticed that the meeting was not private. Michael Brooks was already seated near the conference table. Rebecca Hayes stood beside the windows, holding a folder against her chest. Margaret Collins occupied a chair near the far wall, her yellow legal pad resting neatly on her lap. Ethan Walker sat beside two representatives from the investment consortium. The company's human resources director, Linda Foster, had also been invited. That alone told Allison everything she needed to know. Human resources never attended routine executive discussions, not unless employment decisions had already been made. She closed the door quietly behind her. No one spoke for several seconds. Jason remained standing. "Thank you for coming." Allison nodded politely. "You asked to see me." Jason gestured towards an empty chair. She remained standing. "I'd rather stand." Jason accepted the answer with a slight nod. "As you wish." The room settled into an uncomfortable silence. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued its endless motion. Inside, time seemed to slow. Jason clasped his hands behind his back before speaking. "For the past several weeks, we've discussed repeated delays in the acquisition process." Allison listened without expression. "Our investors have expressed concern. Our board has faced increasing pressure. Our leadership team has struggled to move forward." Every sentence carefully avoided placing blame directly upon her, at least at first. Jason continued, "I've reached a decision." Michael lowered his eyes as though the announcement saddened him. Rebecca's fingers tightened around her folder. Margaret simply watched. Jason inhaled slowly. "Effective immediately." The words echoed across the quiet office. "Now you are relieved of your responsibilities as General Counsel of Nelson Dynamics." Silence. Not a gasp, not a whisper. Only silence. Allison looked directly at Jason. She neither flinched nor protested. Her expression remained almost impossible to read. Jason continued speaking, perhaps because her composure unsettled him. "This decision was not made lightly. I believe the company requires leadership that can support its strategic objectives." Michael finally spoke. "We appreciate everything you've contributed over the years." Allison looked at him briefly. She offered no reply. Jason continued, "Human Resources has prepared the necessary documents." Linda Foster quietly stepped forward with a folder. She looked deeply uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Allison." Allison accepted the folder. "Thank you." She opened it. Termination letter. Benefits summary. Confidentiality reminder. Property return checklist. Everything had been prepared before she entered the room. Exactly as she expected. She closed the folder again. Jason seemed almost surprised by how quickly she finished reading. "Do you have any questions?" "One." Jason nodded. "What would you like to know?" "Is this decision final?" "Yes." "No opportunity for discussion?" Jason hesitated only briefly. "No." Allison nodded once. "I understand." Nothing more. No anger, no accusation, no attempt to defend herself. The absence of resistance made several people in the room visibly uncomfortable. Jason reached toward the conference table. "We'll need your executive badge." Without hesitation, Allison unclipped the identification badge from her jacket. She placed it carefully on the polished wood surface. Next came her electronic access card. Then the company issued security token, one by one, without being asked twice. Linda quietly checked each item from her list. Company laptop. Allison placed it beside the badge. mobile phone. She powered it off before laying it beside the laptop. Every movement remained calm, deliberate, professional. Jason had imagined something entirely different. Perhaps questions, perhaps disappointment, perhaps an argument. Instead, Allison behaved as though she were completing an ordinary administrative procedure. That somehow made the room feel even heavier. Michael attempted to fill the silence. "We'll make every effort to ensure a smooth transition." Allison looked toward him. "I've already documented ongoing legal matters." Michael smiled politely. "That will certainly help." "It should," she paused, "provided someone actually reads them." No sarcasm, only fact. Michael's smile faded slightly. Jason crossed his arms. "The legal department will report directly to outside counsel until a replacement is appointed." Allison simply nodded. "I'll arrange password transfers." "There won't be any need." Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" "My passwords were never personal. They're stored according to company policy." Jason realized she was right. She had designed those procedures herself years earlier. Another quiet reminder that the systems protecting the company existed because of her work. Rebecca finally spoke. "Allison." Everyone turned toward her. She hesitated. Her voice faltered. She couldn't find appropriate words. Allison offered a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to say anything." Rebecca nodded silently. Margaret Collins had not spoken since the meeting began. Now she finally looked toward Jason. "May I ask one question?" Jason answered cautiously. "Of course." "Has Allison violated any law?" "No." "Any company policy?" "No." "Any ethical standard?" Jason remained silent. Margaret repeated herself. "Jason, no." "Then on what basis is she being dismissed?" Jason answered carefully. "Leadership confidence." Margaret wrote several words on her yellow pad. She neither approved nor criticized the explanation. She merely documented it. The simple act unsettled Jason more than an argument might have. Linda finished reviewing the checklist. "There is one final item." She looked almost apologetic. "Security procedure requires an escort from the executive floor." Jason spoke before anyone else could. "Standard protocol." Allison nodded. "I know." She had written part of that protocol herself years ago. She picked up her leather briefcase, the same briefcase she had carried into work nearly every day for more than a decade. Inside rested 3 legal notebooks, several binders, encrypted backups created that morning. Nothing belonging improperly to the company. Everything entirely consistent with legal ethics and company policy. She reached for nothing else. No framed photographs, no personal decorations. Her office had always remained intentionally simple, as though some part of her had never mistaken a workplace for permanence. Jason watched her. "Aren't you taking anything else?" She looked around the office. "I already have everything I need." The answer lingered in the room. No one fully understood it. Not yet. The hallway outside had become strangely quiet. Word traveled faster than official announcements. Employees glanced discreetly from open office doors as Allison walked beside the security supervisor. No one spoke. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked shocked. A few appeared relieved that the rumors had been wrong about public confrontation. There wasn't one. Allison greeted several employees exactly as she always had. "Good afternoon. Take care. I'll miss working with you." Nothing dramatic, no emotional speeches, no bitterness, only dignity. Rebecca followed several steps behind before finally catching up. "Allison." She stopped. Rebecca's eyes glistened. "I don't understand." "You don't need to. There has to be something I can do." "There is." Rebecca waited. "Keep checking the numbers." Rebecca stared at her. "The numbers. They always tell the truth." Before Rebecca could ask another question, Allison gently touched her arm, then continued walking. When they reached Allison's office for the final time, Linda waited respectfully near the doorway. "Take all the time you need. It won't take long." The office looked almost exactly as it had that morning. Organized, quiet, orderly. Allison walked slowly to her desk. She opened the top drawer. Inside rested a fountain pen Jason had given her on their 5th wedding anniversary. She picked it up. Unlike the laptop, the badge, and the phone, it belonged to her. She slipped it into her briefcase. Next, she collected one small family photograph taken years earlier, when Nelson Dynamics still occupied its first tiny office. Jason stood beside her in that picture. Both of them were smiling. Neither knew then how success would eventually test everything they believed about partnership. She looked at the photograph only briefly before placing it inside the briefcase. Nothing else remained. She turned off the desk lamp. For the final time. Back upstairs, Jason stood inside his office watching the elevator display. One number after another. 32, 31, 30, 29. Until finally the elevator disappeared into the lower floors. Michael broke the silence. "It's done." Jason nodded. "Yes. It was necessary." Jason wanted to believe that. Outside investors continued expecting good news. Executives continued preparing for closing day. Everyone assumed the greatest obstacle had finally been removed. No one in Jason's office realized what had quietly left the building inside Allison's leather briefcase. Not confidential company secrets, not stolen documents, not revenge. Something far more important. Years earlier, when Margaret Collins and the board had rewritten the company's governance structure after a failed acquisition attempt, they had created one final legal safeguard. No acquisition exceeding a predetermined financial threshold could become legally binding without the final authorization signature of the sitting General Counsel, who had personally supervised the entire due diligence process. The authority could not be transferred retroactively. It could not be delegated after removal. It could not be replaced by emergency vote. Its purpose had been simple: to prevent exactly the kind of rushed executive decision now unfolding. Jason had signed that governance policy years ago. He simply no longer remembered it. And as Allison stepped out into the rain beyond the glass doors of Nelson Dynamics, the only person capable of completing the billion-dollar acquisition quietly disappeared into the crowded streets of Manhattan. Without raising her voice, without threatening anyone, without looking back. The announcement reached the entire company before Allison Nelson's taxi had crossed Midtown. At 3:18 p.m., employees received a brief internal email from corporate communications. Effective immediately, Allison Nelson is no longer serving as General Counsel of Nelson Dynamics. The company thanks her for her years of service and wishes her success in her future endeavors. No explanation, no details. No mention that she had helped build the legal framework of the company from its earliest days. Within minutes, conversations spread across every department. Some employees believed Allison had made a costly mistake. Others assumed she had chosen to resign. A few quietly wondered why someone with her reputation would suddenly leave only days before the largest transaction in company history. No one had the complete picture. Not yet. Allison arrived at a small office building on Lexington Avenue just before 4 o'clock. The brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Hamilton and Pierce, LLP." The law firm had represented Allison personally for years in matters unrelated to Nelson Dynamics. It specialized in corporate governance and professional ethics. Inside senior partner David Hamilton stood as soon as she entered. David had practiced corporate law for more than 35 years. Gray-haired, deliberate, and known for never raising his voice, he had earned a reputation for solving complicated legal disputes without unnecessary drama. He studied Allison's expression carefully. "You've been terminated." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "When?" "This afternoon." David gestured toward the conference room. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, Allison described every meeting, every request, every document, and every conversation exactly as it had happened. She never exaggerated. She never guessed at motives. Whenever David asked why someone had acted a certain way, her answer remained consistent. "I don't know." He eventually smiled. "You're still refusing to speculate." "I don't intend to start now." "Good." He closed his notebook. Judges appreciate facts much more than theories. Allison opened her briefcase. One by one, she placed her legal notebooks on the table. Then the dated email records. Then the correspondence requesting additional disclosures. Finally, the transaction summaries she had legally preserved under professional responsibility rules. David slowly examined the growing stack. "You prepared for this?" "I prepared for every possibility." He nodded approvingly. "There's a difference." Back at Nelson Dynamics, the mood had shifted dramatically. Jason believed the most difficult decision was behind him. Now the acquisition could finally move forward. At least, that was the expectation. At 5 o'clock, Michael Brooks entered the executive boardroom carrying revised closing documents. "We're ready." Jason looked relieved. "Let's finish this." Rebecca Hayes entered moments later with updated financial schedules. Margaret Collins joined them without speaking. Ethan Walker connected several international partners by video conference. Everything appeared ready. Jason looked around the room. "Legal," Michael answered confidently. "Our interim team has reviewed the remaining documentation." Jason nodded. "Excellent." Linda Foster distributed signature packets. Each executive signed where required. One by one. The atmosphere grew lighter. Someone even smiled. Then Ethan flipped to the final page. His expression changed. He frowned slightly. "Excuse me." Jason looked up. "What is it?" Ethan studied the document again. "This signature block." "What about it?" "It hasn't been completed." Jason glanced down. At the bottom of the page sat one final line. Final legal authorization below it. Blank. Jason looked toward Michael. "I thought legal finished everything." Michael answered immediately. "They did." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." He turned another page, then another. Every closing document contained the same empty signature line. Jason frowned. "Who signs that?" The room became unexpectedly quiet. Rebecca looked toward Margaret. Margaret met her eyes but remained silent. Finally, Ethan answered. "The supervising General Counsel." Jason leaned back. "Fine. We'll have outside counsel sign." Ethan shook his head again. "I can't." "Why not?" "I'm transaction counsel." The governing documents require the supervising General Counsel responsible for due diligence. Jason looked toward Michael. "Then have our acting legal department sign." Michael reached for the company's governance manual. Several uncomfortable seconds passed while he searched. Then his confidence disappeared. Jason's voice sharpened. "What?" Michael looked up slowly. "The authority isn't transferable." Silence. "What do you mean?" Michael continued reading. The final authorization must be executed by... His voice became noticeably quieter. The General Counsel who supervised the complete legal review from the beginning of the transaction. Jason frowned. That's Allison. Yes. She doesn't work here anymore. I know. Jason looked toward Ethan. There has to be another procedure. Ethan answered carefully. I haven't found one. Jason stood. Margaret. She folded her hands calmly. You knew about this. I did. Why didn't anyone mention it? Margaret looked directly at him. Because no one asked. Jason stared at her. This is a billion-dollar acquisition. And the governance policy was written specifically for billion-dollar acquisitions. Jason rubbed his forehead. When was this adopted? Margaret answered immediately. 7 years ago. Jason searched his memory, then suddenly remembered. A failed acquisition, regulatory concerns, emergency board meetings, months of legal reforms. He himself had voted in favor of strengthening legal oversight. At the time it had seemed obvious. Protect the company from reckless decisions, require independent legal certification, prevent executives from bypassing due diligence. Jason had supported every measure. He simply never imagined those same safeguards might one day stand between him and the biggest deal of his career. Rebecca quietly opened another copy of the governance policy. There are additional provisions. Jason looked toward her. Read them. Rebecca did. The final authorization cannot be delegated after commencement of legal review. The reviewing General Counsel must certify that all requested disclosures have been satisfactorily resolved. The certification shall remain independent of executive direction. Jason closed his eyes briefly. Allison hadn't been delaying the process because she wanted control. The company itself required her independent judgment. He remembered laughing years earlier when Allison insisted the clause should be written exactly that way. One day, she had said, someone will be grateful this language exists. At the time, he had admired her precision. Now he cursed it. Michael broke the silence. We'll amend the bylaws. Margaret immediately answered. No. Jason looked up. No. The bylaws cannot be amended after execution of transaction documents. What about emergency authority? No. Special board resolution? No. Temporary appointment? No. Each answer came without hesitation. Margaret had spent decades interpreting governance law. She already knew every possible shortcut. None existed. Jason paced toward the windows. There has to be something. Ethan quietly replied. There is. Everyone turned. Miss Nelson? Jason stopped walking. So we bring Allison back. Margaret asked calmly. For what purpose? To sign. Margaret continued watching him. And if she refuses, Jason answered immediately. She won't. Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she asked another question. Why are you so certain? Jason opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because he suddenly realized something painfully obvious. He no longer knew. The woman he expected to obey had quietly accepted public humiliation without defending herself. She hadn't argued. She hadn't begged. She hadn't negotiated. She had simply walked away. He no longer understood what she might do. At the same time, Allison remained inside David Hamilton's conference room. David finished reviewing the governance documents. He removed his reading glasses. Interesting. What is... You didn't tell me about this provision. I assumed you'd find it. I did. He tapped the page gently. You hold the final authorization. Yes. And no one else can execute it. Correct. David leaned back thoughtfully. They're going to call. Allison remained silent. They'll probably call today. I know. What will you say? She looked toward the city skyline beyond the conference room windows. I'll listen. And then, I'll ask for complete disclosure. David smiled faintly. Still the lawyer. I've always been the lawyer. Her phone remained on the conference table, powered on again after returning her company device. Completely silent. For now. Back at Nelson Dynamics, the boardroom had lost every trace of celebration. The expensive catered dinner prepared for executives remained untouched. Presentation screens still displayed optimistic projections. No one looked at them anymore. Jason finally picked up his personal phone. He stared at Allison's number. His thumb hovered above the screen. Just a few hours earlier, he had ordered human resources to escort her from the building. Now the future of the billion-dollar acquisition depended entirely upon the woman he had publicly dismissed. He pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then transferred to voicemail. Jason ended the call without leaving a message. For the first time since becoming CEO, he felt something unfamiliar. Not frustration, not anger, helplessness, because every executive order he could issue, every employee he could direct, every investor waiting for answers, every dollar committed to the transaction had suddenly become irrelevant. The only person capable of moving the acquisition forward was no longer inside his company, and she had absolutely no obligation to answer his call. Jason Nelson did not sleep that night. The lights remained on in his office long after the rest of the executive floor had gone dark. The skyline outside shimmered across the Hudson, but he barely noticed it. Every few minutes, he picked up his phone, opened Allison's contact, stared at the unanswered call, then placed the device back on his desk. He had spent years believing authority could solve almost any problem. If a department missed a deadline, he replaced its manager. If negotiations stalled, he called the other CEO personally. If investors hesitated, he flew across the country to meet them. Leadership, as he understood it, meant removing obstacles. Tonight, for the first time in years, he faced an obstacle that refused to move simply because he wanted it to. And unlike every previous challenge, this one had a name. Allison. Shortly after 7 the following morning, the executive conference room filled once again. No one bothered with small talk. Coffee cups sat untouched. Presentation screens remained black. Jason entered carrying only a legal pad. He looked older than he had 24 hours earlier. We need options. Michael Brooks spoke first. I've already contacted 3 major corporate law firms. And they all reached the same conclusion. Jason already knew the answer before asking. They can't sign. No. What about emergency court authorization? Ethan Walker answered this time. The courts won't rewrite a company's governance documents simply because management regrets a personnel decision. Jason looked toward Margaret Collins. You've been through corporate crises before. Margaret folded her hands. I have. What would you do? I would first understand why Allison refused to sign. Jason frowned. She never refused. No. Margaret's voice remained calm. She requested additional information. Rebecca quietly added, information we still haven't provided. The room fell silent. Jason turned toward Michael. Weren't those documents already requested? Michael shifted slightly in his chair. They were. Why weren't they delivered? The seller claimed they weren't material. Rebecca looked directly at him. That isn't the question. Michael frowned. It answers the question. No. Rebecca opened a financial report. The question was whether we ever received them. Michael hesitated. No. Rebecca closed the file. Then Allison was correct. No one immediately responded. The sentence settled over the room with uncomfortable weight. Across town, Allison arrived at Hamilton and Pierce shortly before 8:30. David Hamilton was already reviewing several printed documents spread across the conference table. He looked up as she entered. "I've been reading your correspondence." She removed her coat. "What do you think?" "I think someone worked very hard to avoid answering simple questions." Allison nodded. "I reached the same conclusion." David pointed toward a stack of emails. "Your requests became increasingly specific." They had to. And their responses became increasingly vague. "They did." David adjusted his glasses. "That's rarely accidental." Allison sat quietly. The conference room overlooked Lexington Avenue, where morning traffic crawled through another busy day. Lawyers hurried into neighboring office buildings carrying briefcases almost identical to hers. Ordinary people, ordinary work. Yet inside this room, the future of one of the country's largest corporate acquisitions rested upon documents that most people would never understand. David slid another folder across the table. "I also reviewed the financial disclosures, and there are still missing banking records." Allison opened the folder. Several pages had been marked with yellow tabs. David continued. "The consulting firms receiving these payments have incomplete ownership disclosures." I noticed. "And this company," he tapped another page, "appears repeatedly without sufficient supporting documentation." Allison looked carefully at the name. Silver Crest Advisory Group. It had appeared several times during her own review. Not prominently, almost discreetly, small enough to escape attention, large enough to matter. "I requested complete records." David nodded. "You did." "They never arrived." "They still haven't." Allison wrote another note inside her notebook. Company name, reference number, outstanding request. Nothing else. Back at Nelson Dynamics, Jason made another decision. "I'm going to speak with the seller directly." Ethan looked surprised. "They'll tell you the same thing they've told us. I want to hear it myself." Within an hour, Jason sat in a secure video conference with executives representing the company being acquired. After routine greetings, he moved directly to the issue. "My legal department requested additional banking records." The seller's chief executive smiled politely. "Our advisors assured us everything material has already been disclosed." Jason leaned forward. "I'm requesting the remaining records." The executive exchanged a glance with someone off camera. "We're not certain they're relevant." Jason's patience began thinning. "That determination belongs to my legal team." Another brief silence. Finally, the executive answered, "We'll discuss it internally." Jason ended the call more frustrated than before. He had expected resistance. He had not expected hesitation. The difference mattered. Rebecca spent the morning reviewing archived accounting data. She wasn't looking for fraud. She was looking for explanations. If legitimate business reasons existed, she wanted to find them before assumptions filled the gap. Hours passed. Spreadsheets covered her conference table. Then one particular payment caught her attention. The amount itself wasn't extraordinary. Its timing was. The transfer occurred exactly 48 hours before another payment moved through Silvercrest Advisory Group. Rebecca compared account numbers, different companies, nearly identical routing information. She frowned. That can't be right. She opened older financial archives, then older ones still. The same pattern appeared again, always small enough to avoid attracting attention, always connected to the same consulting firm. Rebecca immediately called Jason. "I found something." "How serious?" "I don't know yet." Jason almost laughed. "You're starting to sound like Allison." Rebecca answered quietly. Maybe there's a reason she kept saying it. Meanwhile, Allison continued reconstructing the acquisition timeline. Instead of focusing only on financial transactions, she began comparing internal communications against document revisions. Every contract changed during negotiations. That was normal. What interested her were changes that appeared after negotiations supposedly ended. She spread 6 different versions of one disclosure agreement across the conference table. Version 1, Version 2, Version 3, Version 4, Version 5, Final version. At first glance, they appeared identical. She read them line by line, then paragraph by paragraph. Finally, she stopped. A single footnote had disappeared. Only 3 lines, barely noticeable. Yet those 3 lines referenced additional banking schedules no longer attached. She compared earlier emails. The attachment had once existed. Later versions omitted it entirely. She circled the missing reference. David looked over. "What did you find?" "Not evidence." "What then?" "Another missing piece." David smiled. "You have remarkable patience." "I don't have another choice." That afternoon, Rebecca requested access to archived email backups. The company's IT director approved the request after receiving authorization from Margaret Collins. Rebecca wasn't searching for private conversations. She wanted correspondence connected to financial disclosures. The archive contained thousands of messages. Most proved entirely routine. Approval requests, meeting invitations, spreadsheet revisions. Nothing unusual. Then one email chain drew her attention. Michael Brooks had forwarded one of Allison's disclosure requests to another executive months earlier. Rebecca opened it. The message itself was short. "Legal is asking for additional banking schedules again. Handle this before it slows us down further." Attached below appeared another response. "We're still waiting on the seller." Then another. "Let's discuss offline before sending anything." Rebecca frowned. The final reply contained no attachment. Only one sentence. "Leave it with me." She immediately printed the correspondence. Not because it proved wrongdoing. Because it raised new questions. Questions Allison had never stopped asking. Late that afternoon, David returned from a meeting carrying another document. "I've spoken with a forensic accounting specialist." Allison looked up. "What did they say?" "They reviewed the transaction flow you mapped." "And?" "They agree the payment structure deserves closer examination." "Enough for allegations?" "No. Enough for concern." "Absolutely." Allison nodded. That was all she needed. Not certainty. Just professional confirmation that continued investigation remained justified. She added another note. Independent review supports expanded due diligence. No accusations, only documented observations. Back at Nelson Dynamics, Jason stood alone inside Allison's former office. The room had already been cleared. The shelves looked strangely empty. The desk remained perfectly organized. Nothing personal remained except a small indentation where a desk lamp had once stood. Jason slowly walked around the room. For years he had rarely entered here. Now the silence felt almost overwhelming. He opened one empty drawer, closed it again. He noticed the whiteboard on the wall. Every task had been erased before Allison left. Except One sentence, written in small handwriting near the bottom corner. Verification protects everyone. No signature, no date, just 6 words. Jason stared at them longer than he intended. For the first time, he wondered whether he had misunderstood not only Allison's actions, but the entire purpose behind everything she had been trying to do. At that same moment, several miles away, Allison closed another binder and looked down at the growing collection of unanswered requests spread across the conference table. The evidence still didn't reveal the complete truth, but it revealed something equally important. Someone had invested extraordinary effort into ensuring the complete truth remained difficult to find. And that realization convinced her of one thing. She was no longer investigating simple administrative delays. She was following a trail that someone had deliberately tried to erase. By Friday morning, the billion-dollar acquisition had quietly transformed from the most anticipated corporate announcement of the year into one of Wall Street's most closely watched mysteries. No official explanation had been released. No press conference had been canceled. Yet financial reporters began noticing something unusual. The signing ceremony that investment banks had confidently scheduled had simply disappeared from every executive calendar. Business journalists called investor relations. They received carefully worded responses. The transaction remains under review. Nothing more. For a deal of this magnitude, silence often attracted more attention than failure. Inside Nelson Dynamics, everyone could feel it. Jason arrived before sunrise. The lobby security guard greeted him with the same respectful smile as always, but Jason barely noticed. He rode the elevator alone. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, something immediately felt different. People still worked. Phones still rang. Meetings still happened. Yet, beneath the routine lay a quiet anxiety that hadn't existed only a week earlier. Employees lowered their voices whenever executives walked past. Assistants exchanged uncertain glances. No one knew exactly what was happening. Everyone sensed that the company stood on unstable ground. Jason walked directly into the boardroom. Margaret Collins was already there. She sat alone, reviewing governance documents. "You've been here long?" "An hour." She closed her folder. "You look tired." "I didn't sleep." "I suspected as much." Jason poured himself coffee before sitting across from her. "I need your advice." Margaret waited. "What happens if this deal collapses?" She answered honestly. "The company survives." Jason looked surprised. "The shareholders won't be happy." "No." "The market will react." "Yes. But we'll survive." Jason looked down into his coffee. "And if we close without proper authorization?" Margaret didn't hesitate. The acquisition could be challenged in court. Contracts could become unenforceable. Regulators could intervene. Shareholders could sue. She paused. The damage would extend far beyond this transaction. Jason slowly nodded. He understood. The company wasn't simply waiting for Allison because of internal policy. The law itself expected independent legal certification. Removing Allison had not removed the legal responsibility she represented. At Hamilton and Pierce, Allison arrived, carrying another box of documents. David Hamilton had invited 2 additional attorneys specializing in forensic corporate investigations. Neither attorney knew Jason. Neither had any personal connection to Nelson Dynamics, exactly as Allison wanted. Independent review mattered. Confirmation mattered. Objectivity mattered most. David introduced them. Laura Mitchell, a former federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, and Benjamin Ortiz, a corporate governance expert with decades of merger experience. Allison greeted both politely before laying out the chronology she had prepared. She began at the beginning, not with conclusions, with dates, every request for disclosure, every response, every missing attachment, every revised contract, every unexplained payment. Nearly 2 hours passed before anyone interrupted. Laura finally leaned back. "You've documented everything." "I've tried." Benjamin examined one notebook. "You date every conversation." "Yes." "You record who attended." "Yes." "You distinguish between facts and assumptions." "I do." Benjamin smiled faintly. "I wish every corporate client worked this way." David added quietly, "It makes legal disputes considerably shorter." Laura folded her hands. "So, what exactly are we looking for?" Allison answered carefully. "I don't know." Laura laughed softly. "I believe you." Allison looked at her. "I know something is incomplete, but I don't know whether the explanation is negligence or something worse." Laura nodded approvingly. "That's the correct answer." The team divided the documents. Benjamin reviewed governance compliance. Laura examined financial correspondence. David focused on disclosure obligations. Allison reconstructed the acquisition timeline minute by minute. By lunchtime, patterns slowly began emerging. Not proof, patterns. Laura pointed towards several printed emails. These disclosure requests stopped receiving direct answers. Benjamin looked over. They were redirected. David added, "Usually through Michael Brooks." Allison wrote another note. Not accusation, observation. Repeated communication bottleneck. Across town, Rebecca Hayes continued investigating independently. She had not informed Jason about every discovery, not because she distrusted him, because she wanted certainty before presenting conclusions. She requested archived banking confirmations directly from the company's Treasury Department. The manager apologized. "We don't have complete copies." Rebecca frowned. "Why not?" "They were never uploaded." "When were they requested?" The manager checked the system. "Months ago." "Who handled the request?" He looked again. "It appears..." He hesitated. "It was reassigned." "To whom?" "Executive Operations." Rebecca already knew who supervised executive operations. Michael Brooks. She thanked the manager before ending the call. Another unanswered question. Another missing document. Another connection leading toward the same executive. Still, connections were not evidence. She reminded herself of something Allison often repeated. Coincidences deserve investigation. They do not deserve conclusions. Rebecca smiled sadly. She had heard that sentence dozens of times. Only now did she fully appreciate its value. That afternoon, Jason finally left Allison a voicemail. His voice sounded noticeably different from the confident executive who had dismissed her only 2 days earlier. "Allison," he paused. "I know you're probably busy." Another pause. "We need to talk. I'm asking for a meeting. No assumptions. No arguments. Just a conversation." He almost said more. Instead, he ended the message with, "Please call me." He listened once before sending it. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't giving instructions. He was making a request. At 3:30, Allison listened to the voicemail inside David's office. David remained silent until it ended. "What do you think?" "He sounds worried." "He is." She set the phone down. David waited. "Will you return the call?" "Not yet." "Why?" "Because nothing has changed." David nodded. "What would need to change?" They would need to provide the information they've withheld. And if they don't, then there's nothing to discuss. Her answer contained no anger, only professional logic. David respected it. Benjamin interrupted from across the conference table. I found something. Everyone gathered around. He pointed toward the company's governance resolution adopted 7 years earlier. Most directors had signed electronically. One handwritten amendment appeared in the margin, Margaret Collins's signature. Alongside it, another signature, Allison's. David adjusted his glasses. What's significant? Benjamin read aloud. In the event material disclosure requests remain unresolved, final authorization shall not be executed until satisfactory verification has been completed. Laura looked up. That language is unusually strong. Benjamin nodded. It effectively creates an independent legal checkpoint. David turned toward Allison. You helped draft this. I did. Why? She answered quietly. Because we'd nearly made the same mistake once before. Everyone looked at her. She continued. Years ago, another acquisition almost proceeded without complete disclosure. What happened? We stopped it. Laura asked, who insisted. Allison smiled, almost imperceptibly. Jason. The room became unexpectedly quiet. David looked surprised. He supported stronger legal safeguards. He insisted on them. Benjamin slowly closed the governance binder. The irony is remarkable. Allison didn't respond because she wasn't interested in irony, only facts. Late that afternoon, Laura completed her review of financial correspondence. She removed one printed email from the stack. This deserves attention. Everyone gathered again. The message came from a financial advisor working for the seller. Its wording appeared ordinary, except for one sentence. Certain supporting schedules remain under internal review and will be provided if requested during final certification. Laura pointed toward the date. This email predates Allison's first request. David frowned. So they already knew additional schedules existed. Benjamin nodded. And those schedules were never produced. Allison carefully compared the email against her notebook. She had indeed requested those exact schedules weeks later. The response she received had been different. No additional schedules exist. Laura looked at everyone. Those statements cannot both be true. No one disagreed. Still, they needed the schedules themselves, not merely conflicting emails, evidence, always evidence. Back at Nelson Dynamics, Rebecca walked into Jason's office carrying a thick folder. I think you should see this. Jason looked exhausted. What is it? Communication records. He opened the folder. Emails, transfer requests, document logs. Several pages carried Michael Brooks's approval. Jason read silently. After several minutes, he looked up. Are you suggesting Michael intentionally blocked disclosures? Rebecca answered exactly as Allison would have. I'm suggesting the documents raise questions. Jason almost smiled. You've started sounding like Allison too. Rebecca met his eyes. Maybe because she was right. Jason leaned back slowly. For the first time, the possibility entered his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Perhaps Allison had never been standing in the way of the acquisition. Perhaps she had been standing between the company and a mistake no one else had taken seriously enough to investigate. Meanwhile, across the city, Allison closed her notebook after writing one final sentence beneath the day's findings. The missing records existed. Someone acknowledged them. Someone later denied them. She set down her pen. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Not completely, but enough to reveal that the billion-dollar acquisition was no longer simply waiting for one signature. It was waiting for the truth hidden behind documents that powerful people had worked very hard to keep out of sight. Monday morning arrived with an unusual quiet over Nelson Dynamics. Normally, the beginning of the week brought a familiar rhythm of executive meetings, investor calls, and department briefings. This Monday felt different. Every conversation seemed shorter. Every smile appeared forced. The acquisition had officially entered what attorneys referred to as a temporary procedural delay. Investors called it something else. Trouble. No public announcement had been made, but major financial institutions had already begun asking difficult questions. Why had the signing ceremony been postponed? Why had legal approval not been completed? Why were additional reviews suddenly necessary only days before closing? Investor relations repeated the same prepared statement. The company continues to conduct appropriate legal and financial due diligence. The wording satisfied no one. Jason Nelson stood inside the executive boardroom reviewing market reports. Nelson Dynamics stock had not collapsed. Not yet. But analysts had begun lowering confidence ratings. Several investment funds requested emergency briefings. The company's largest institutional shareholder wanted a direct meeting with the board. Jason knew how quickly uncertainty could become panic. Michael Brooks entered carrying updated schedules. "I've revised the acquisition timeline." Jason barely looked at them. "We don't have a timeline anymore." Michael hesitated. "We still need to project confidence." Jason looked up. "Confidence without facts is advertising." Michael blinked. The sentence sounded strangely familiar. Jason realized why. He had heard Allison say something nearly identical years earlier. Rebecca Hayes entered moments later. "I've completed another financial review." Jason motioned toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." Rebecca placed several folders on the table. "I found additional inconsistencies." Jason closed his eyes briefly. "More?" "Yes." She opened the first folder. "I compared Treasury confirmations against payment authorizations." Jason leaned forward. "What did you find?" "Some payments were approved before supporting documentation existed." Michael immediately responded. "Administrative delays happen." Rebecca calmly shook her head. "Administrative delays don't usually happen in exactly the same pattern 6 different times." She slid several spreadsheets across the table. "These transactions all passed through Silvercrest Advisory Group." Michael frowned. "Consulting firms often coordinate complex acquisitions." Rebecca nodded. "They do? But they also issue invoices." She turned another page. "I still can't find any." Silence filled the room. Jason looked toward Michael. "Have we requested them?" Michael answered carefully. "We've requested supporting documentation." Rebecca corrected him. "We requested ownership disclosures." "I requested invoices this morning." Jason looked surprised. "You hadn't requested them before?" Rebecca met his eyes. "No." "Why not?" "Because I assumed someone else already had." The implication settled over the room. Too many people had assumed someone else was asking the necessary questions. Only Allison had actually continued asking them. At Hamilton and Pierce, Allison spent the morning reviewing archived email servers provided through lawful discovery procedures connected to her professional responsibilities. David Hamilton entered carrying fresh coffee. "Any progress?" "A little." She pointed toward her computer screen. "I reconstructed the disclosure timeline." David studied it. Colored lines connected dozens of emails, financial reports, and document revisions. Every request, every response, every missing attachment, every delayed explanation. The visual pattern surprised even him. It almost looks intentional. Allison quietly answered, "It looks incomplete." David smiled. "You remain remarkably disciplined." "I have to." He nodded. "Courts reward restraint." She continued comparing timestamps. Then something unusual caught her attention. 2 emails sent only 3 minutes apart. Same sender, different recipients. The first message: "Please provide complete banking schedules to legal." The second: "Hold until further discussion." Both originated from executive operations. Both carried Michael Brooks's authorization. Allison stared at the screen. David noticed immediately. "What did you find?" She rotated the monitor toward him. He read silently. Then again. "They contradict each other." "They do. Any explanation?" "Not yet." She printed both emails. Another piece. Still not enough. Meanwhile, Margaret Collins requested a special meeting of the audit committee. Only 4 people attended. Margaret, Rebecca, 2 independent directors. Michael had not been invited. Neither had Jason. Margaret believed the committee needed an objective discussion before emotions influenced judgment. Rebecca presented her findings carefully. No conclusions, only observations. Margaret appreciated the wording. Rebecca reviewed payment flows, missing invoices, outstanding disclosure requests, repeated delays involving the same intermediary companies. One director asked, "Do we have evidence of misconduct?" Rebecca answered exactly as Allison would have. "No." "Do we have evidence requiring further investigation?" "Absolutely." Margaret looked around the table. "Then our responsibility is clear." Another director nodded. "We expand the investigation." No one objected. That afternoon, Jason received another call from the investment consortium. This time, Ethan Walker sounded noticeably more serious. "Our clients need clarity," Jason answered honestly. "We're working through additional legal review." Ethan remained quiet for several seconds. "Jason?" "Yes. I need to ask something difficult." "Go ahead." "Did Allison identify these issues before she was terminated?" Jason hesitated. "Yes." "And were they resolved?" "No." Ethan sighed softly. "My clients are beginning to wonder whether they should have listened to her instead." Jason stared through the windows of his office. Outside, helicopters crossed the Manhattan skyline. Below them, thousands of people hurried through ordinary business days. Inside his office, one sentence echoed repeatedly. Perhaps they should have listened to her. Across the city, Laura Mitchell finally completed her independent review of the financial correspondence. She placed 3 folders on the conference table. "I found something interesting." David looked up. "What?" Laura opened the first folder. Every time Allison requested supporting banking schedules, she opened another. Someone redirected the discussion away from the documents. Then the third. And every redirection involved executive operations. David frowned. "Michael?" Laura nodded. "Repeatedly." Allison remained silent. Laura looked toward her. "Aren't you going to say anything?" "I don't know why." Laura smiled. "There it is again." "What?" "I don't know." Allison looked slightly confused. Laura leaned back. "Most clients would already be accusing someone. I'm not most clients." "No," Laura nodded. "You're exactly the kind of witness judges trust." David picked up another email. "This one concerns me even more." He passed it around. The message came from one of the seller's outside accountants. Additional supporting schedules remain available upon formal certification request. The date caught everyone's attention. It had been sent 6 weeks earlier. David looked at Allison. "Did you ever receive these schedules?" "No." Laura asked, "Did anyone tell you they existed?" "No." Benjamin Ortiz quietly added, "Someone knew." Everyone fell silent, because the email proved one important fact. The missing records had not been imaginary. They had existed all along. The only remaining question was why they had never reached Allison. Late that afternoon, Rebecca entered Jason's office carrying another stack of printed emails. "I've been comparing communication records." Jason rubbed tired eyes. "Please tell me something finally makes sense." Rebecca placed two nearly identical email chains beside one another. They were sent the same day. Jason began reading. One version forwarded Allison's request. The second instructed someone to delay responding. He looked up slowly. "These came from Michael." Rebecca nodded. "They did." Michael entered the office at that exact moment. He immediately noticed the document spread across Jason's desk. "What's going on?" Jason held up the printed emails. "Can you explain these?" Michael glanced at them briefly. "Routine coordination." Rebecca calmly interrupted. "Routine coordination doesn't usually involve delaying legal disclosures." Michael answered confidently. "I was trying to prevent unnecessary confusion." Jason asked quietly, "By withholding documents?" "I never withheld anything." "You delayed them." "I prioritized operational efficiency." Rebecca spoke again. "Efficiency isn't a legal defense." The room became uncomfortably still. Michael looked toward Jason. "You don't actually think I sabotaged this acquisition?" Jason answered carefully, "I don't know what to think anymore." For Michael, that answer proved more unsettling than any accusation. Because until now, Jason had trusted him without hesitation. Now, doubt had entered the room. That evening, Allison sat alone, reviewing her handwritten notebook one final time before leaving the office. She slowly turned each page. Dates, meetings, emails, financial references, questions, responses, everything documented in chronological order. She stopped near the final pages. There, written weeks earlier, appeared a sentence she had almost forgotten. Requested complete banking schedules. Response documents unavailable. Explanation inconsistent with prior correspondence. She compared it against Laura's newly discovered email. The timelines matched perfectly. Someone had acknowledged the schedules existed. Someone else later insisted they did not. For the first time since beginning the investigation, Allison felt something close to certainty. Not certainty about guilt, certainty about process. The truth could no longer be uncovered through assumptions. It required the missing records themselves. Without them, no responsible attorney could sign. Without them, no ethical general counsel would authorize a billion-dollar acquisition. She closed the notebook gently. Across Manhattan, Jason remained in his office staring at the same emails Rebecca had uncovered. Each page forced him toward an increasingly uncomfortable realization. The obstacle he had removed had never been the obstacle at all. And somewhere between the missing bank records, contradictory emails, and delayed disclosures, the real story had only just begun. Tuesday morning began not with another investor call, but with a notice from Margaret Collins. Special meeting of the Board of Directors attendance required 9:00 a.m. Unlike previous meetings, this invitation listed a detailed agenda. Independent audit review, governance, compliance, acquisition, due diligence. There was one additional line that immediately caught Jason Nelson's attention: presentation of supporting documentation. He read the notice twice, then a third time. Margaret had never been known to call unnecessary meetings. If she was convening the full board, she already believed enough information existed to justify formal review. That realization unsettled him far more than another postponed signing ceremony. By 9 o'clock, every board member had taken a seat around the long walnut conference table. The atmosphere felt nothing like the optimistic gatherings held only a week earlier. No catered breakfast, no promotional presentation, no discussion of market expansion. Instead, every chair held neatly organized binders prepared by the audit committee. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Jason occupied his usual seat to her right. Michael Brooks appeared confident, though noticeably quieter than usual. Rebecca Hayes placed several thick folders in front of her. Ethan Walker joined by secure video conference. Several independent outside attorneys observed without participating. One chair remained empty, the one Allison had occupied for years. Jason found himself looking toward it more than once. Margaret called the meeting to order. "Thank you for attending." She paused briefly. "Our responsibility today is not to determine blame. We are here to determine facts." Jason recognized the wording immediately. It sounded exactly like Allison. Margaret continued. "The audit committee has reviewed preliminary financial materials. We have also reviewed correspondence connected to the acquisition." She looked toward Rebecca. "Please begin." Rebecca stood calmly. She had never enjoyed public speaking. Numbers were easier than audiences. Still today, her voice remained steady. "The purpose of this presentation is limited." She deliberately emphasized each word. "I am not presenting conclusions. I am presenting documented observations." She opened the first binder. A timeline appeared on the large screen behind her. Every disclosure request, every financial transfer, every revision, every delayed response. The information stretched across several months. Rebecca pointed toward the first highlighted section. These were Allison Nelson's original requests for supporting banking schedules. Another click. These are the responses she received. Another. These are the records we later discovered indicating additional schedules existed. Silence settled over the room. One independent director leaned forward. "So, legal requested documents that were available, but never received them." Rebecca nodded. "That is correct." Jason looked toward Michael. Michael remained expressionless. Rebecca continued. "Our next section concerns payment routing." Graphs appeared on the screen. Colored lines traced money flowing between companies. Silver Crest Advisory Group appeared repeatedly. "So far," Rebecca explained, "that we have found no evidence establishing criminal conduct." She deliberately chose every word with care. "However," another slide appeared. "We have identified repeated transactions lacking complete supporting documentation." One director interrupted. "Could those documents simply be missing?" "They could," Rebecca answered honestly. "They could also exist elsewhere. Or they may never have been requested." She paused. "We simply do not know." Again, Jason recognized the discipline in her language. No speculation, only verified facts. He remembered teasing Allison years earlier for speaking exactly that way. Now he understood why. Facts survived scrutiny. Assumptions rarely did. Margaret thanked Rebecca before opening another binder. "Our independent governance review has also been completed." She looked toward Benjamin Ortiz, who attended remotely as an outside governance expert retained by Hamilton and Pierce for an independent legal opinion. Benjamin spoke calmly. "I have reviewed the company's governing resolutions. The final authorization provision is both valid and enforceable." Jason already knew that. Still hearing it again carried weight. Benjamin continued. The provision exists to protect shareholders. It intentionally prevents executive pressure from overriding independent legal review. One director asked, "Can the board waive the requirement?" Benjamin answered immediately, "No." Can the CEO? No. Can outside counsel? No. The requirement belongs solely to the supervising General Counsel responsible for due diligence. Jason lowered his eyes. Everyone in the room knew who that person was. The meeting paused briefly before Margaret introduced the next topic. "There is another matter requiring discussion." She looked toward Jason. "Communication records." Jason nodded. "Proceed." Rebecca distributed printed email chains. Jason had already seen most of them. Several directors had not. As pages turned, expressions gradually changed. Nothing dramatic appeared. No explicit admissions, no obvious conspiracy. Instead, something subtler emerged. Every time Allison requested additional records, someone redirected the conversation. Every time disclosures approached completion, requests were postponed. Every delay passed through executive operations. One director finally asked, "Mr. Brooks?" Michael looked up. "Yes. Can you explain why these communications repeatedly instructed departments to delay responding?" Michael remained composed. The acquisition involved hundreds of moving parts. "My intention was coordination." Another director asked, "Coordination or delay?" "Coordination," Rebecca quietly spoke. The requests, nevertheless, remained unanswered. Michael turned toward her. "That wasn't my decision." "Whose was it?" "I don't know." The answer hung in the air. No one challenged him immediately, because unlike television dramas, real board investigations rarely ended with dramatic confessions. They ended with careful documentation. Margaret wrote another note. Nothing more. At the same time, several miles away, Allison remained inside Hamilton and Pierce, reviewing another collection of archived correspondence. Laura Mitchell entered, carrying a portable hard drive. Our forensic accounting team completed another comparison. Allison looked up. "What did they find?" Laura connected the drive to her laptop. Thousands of transaction logs appeared. "Nothing illegal." She smiled slightly. "I know." Allison smiled back. "What else?" Laura enlarged one particular chart. Timing. The payments themselves were not extraordinary. The timing was. Nearly every questionable transaction occurred within 24 hours of major disclosure requests from Allison. David Hamilton walked over. "Show me." Laura pointed carefully. "Here's Allison requesting supporting banking schedules." She highlighted the date. 20 hours later, another line appeared. Payments shifted through intermediary companies. David frowned. "Coincidence?" Laura shrugged. "Possibly." "Enough to investigate?" "Absolutely." Allison quietly wrote another note. Again, no conclusions, only chronology. Her phone vibrated. This time, she answered. "Allison speaking." "Miss Nelson?" Margaret Collins' familiar voice came through the receiver. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." Margaret hesitated briefly. "I wanted to inform you personally. The board has initiated a formal governance review. I assumed that might happen. We also reviewed your disclosure requests." Allison remained silent. Margaret continued. "You were justified in requesting every one of them." Allison closed her eyes briefly, not in satisfaction, in relief. Someone had finally read the documents. "Thank you," Margaret spoke gently. "I also owe you an apology." "There is no need." "There is." Another pause. The board should have asked more questions before allowing recent events to unfold. Allison answered quietly. My responsibility was to ask them. And you did. Margaret's voice softened. We failed to listen. Back inside the boardroom, Ethan Walker requested permission to address the directors. Margaret agreed. Ethan appeared on the large screen. My clients have reviewed the recent developments. Jason listened carefully. They remain interested in the acquisition. Several directors looked surprised. Ethan continued. However, there will be no transaction until the legal review is completed to the satisfaction of the supervising General Counsel. No one spoke. Ethan added one final sentence. Our clients now consider Miss Nelson's independent certification essential. Jason slowly leaned back. Only days earlier, investors had viewed Allison as the executive delaying progress. Now they viewed her as the person protecting the transaction itself. The reversal felt almost unbelievable. The meeting ended shortly before noon. Most directors left quietly. Jason remained seated. Margaret approached. You've been unusually quiet. He looked toward the empty chair Allison once occupied. I've been remembering. What? The early years. Margaret waited. Jason smiled sadly. Every major decision, every contract, every acquisition. I used to tell everyone. He paused, that nothing important happened until Allison said it was legally ready. Margaret nodded. I remember. I stopped believing it. No, she corrected gently. You stopped remembering why you believed it. Jason looked down at the binders covering the conference table. Email after email, record after record, question after question. Everything Allison had asked for suddenly appeared reasonable, necessary, professional. He realized something that hurt more than the delayed acquisition. She had never changed. He had. Across the city, Allison closed another notebook after documenting the board's formal review. She looked through the conference room window at the busy Manhattan streets below. People hurried to meetings. Taxi horns echoed between buildings. Life moved forward, as always. Inside her notebook, however, the investigation had reached an entirely new stage. No longer was she the only person asking difficult questions. Now the board was asking them too. And once a board of directors begins demanding complete answers, the truth becomes much harder to keep hidden. The first full break in the silence came on Thursday morning. It wasn't a press leak. It wasn't an investor complaint. It was a single internal memo from the audit committee circulated to the board and senior executives. Subject: preliminary findings. Acquisition review. Jason Nelson read it 3 times before he reached the end. Rebecca Hayes stood beside him, waiting. Michael Brooks had already been called into an emergency clarification session with the committee. Ethan Walker remained on standby for legal consultation. And Margaret Collins had requested that Allison Nelson be granted secure access to present her findings directly to the board. Jason finally lowered the memo. This is escalating faster than I expected. Rebecca answered carefully. It's not escalating. It's being documented. Jason looked at her. That's the same thing. No, she replied. One is emotion. The other is process. That distinction lingered uncomfortably in the room. At Hamilton and Pierce, Allison was already preparing her presentation. For the first time since the investigation began, she was not adding new data. She was organizing what already existed. David Hamilton reviewed her materials carefully. You're ready? I'm organized. That's the same thing in court. Allison didn't respond. She had learned long ago that confidence without verification was dangerous, and certainty without documentation was worse. Laura Mitchell entered the conference room carrying a final summary report. "We've completed cross-validation of the transaction trail." Allison looked up, and Laura placed the report on the table. "No illegal transaction confirmed." She paused, but Benjamin Ortiz finished the sentence. "But we cannot reconcile the disclosure gaps with standard acquisition protocols." David nodded slowly. "In simpler terms, something is missing." Laura added, "Something critical." Allison closed her notebook. "That's enough." It wasn't satisfaction. It was confirmation that the investigation had reached its necessary threshold. Not proof of wrongdoing, proof of incompleteness. And in corporate law, incompleteness in a billion-dollar acquisition was enough to halt everything. At 11:00 a.m., the board reconvened. This time Allison was present. She did not enter as General Counsel. She entered as the supervising legal authority whose certification determined whether the acquisition could legally proceed. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely from earlier meetings. There was no confidence now, only expectation. Jason watched her take her seat. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret Collins opened the meeting. "This session is for final legal presentation." She looked toward Allison. "You may proceed." Allison stood. She placed a single binder on the table. No theatrics, no build-up, just structure. "I will present 3 categories of findings." She spoke evenly: disclosure completeness, financial transaction integrity, and governance compliance. She opened the first section: disclosure completeness. A screen behind her displayed a timeline. Every request for banking schedules, every response, every delay, every missing attachment. Allison pointed calmly. These requests were made over a period of 9 weeks. She paused. They were acknowledged. She highlighted several emails, but not fully fulfilled. Jason leaned forward slightly. Michael shifted in his seat. Rebecca remained still. Allison continued. In multiple instances, documents referenced in correspondence were later absent from the final data package. She clicked again. The seller's representatives confirmed these documents existed. Another click. Later communications denied their existence. Silence filled the room. Allison didn't react to it. She simply moved to the next section. Financial transaction integrity. Charts appeared. Money flow diagrams. Intermediary structures. Entities layered across jurisdictions. Nothing illegal was stated. Nothing accused. Only patterns. All transactions appear formally compliant on the surface. She paused. However, multiple payment sequences lack supporting invoice verification. Rebecca nodded slightly. Allison continued. In addition, timing correlations exist between disclosure requests and financial restructuring activities. Jason frowned. What does that mean exactly? Allison looked at him briefly. It means changes occurred in financial routing shortly after legal requested information. No speculation, only sequence. Laura Mitchell added quietly from the side. That correlation is statistically significant. Michael immediately responded. Correlation is not causation. Allison agreed immediately. It is not, then she added, but it is reason to investigate further. No one argued with that. She moved to the final section, governance compliance. The room grew quieter. This was the section that mattered most. She opened a printed copy of the company's governance resolution. Her finger traced a specific clause. This provision requires final legal authorization by the supervising General Counsel. She looked around the room. That responsibility cannot be delegated. Jason already knew this, but hearing it in this context made it feel different. More final, Allison continued. The purpose of this clause is to ensure independent verification of disclosure completeness prior to execution of transactions exceeding defined thresholds. She paused. In simple terms, she looked directly at Jason. It exists to prevent exactly what is happening now. The room tightened. No one spoke. Allison closed the binder gently. I cannot certify this transaction as legally complete. A sentence that carried no emotion, only consequence. Jason exhaled slowly. You're saying we can't proceed. I'm saying we cannot legally proceed under current conditions. Michael spoke quickly. Can those conditions be resolved? Allison answered without hesitation. Yes. Rebecca asked, how complete disclosure of all requested banking schedules? Laura added, and verification of intermediary transactions. Benjamin followed, and reconciliation of missing financial documentation. Allison nodded once. Yes. Jason leaned back in his chair. So the deal is not blocked. Allison corrected him calmly. The deal is incomplete. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Margaret Collins closed her notebook. Then the board must decide how to proceed. Jason looked up. There's no decision. There is always a decision, Margaret replied. We can proceed without certification. She paused. Or we can require completion. Rebecca spoke softly. If we proceed without certification, we assume legal exposure. Ethan Walker Connected remotely added, which would likely void financing agreements. Silence again. Jason finally spoke. If we delay, we lose the deal. Margaret looked at him. If we proceed incorrectly, we lose the company. That sentence landed harder than any financial report. For the first time, Jason looked directly at Allison without frustration, only understanding. Did you ever think I would get here? Allison didn't hesitate. Yes. Jason frowned slightly. You expected this. I expected the system to function exactly as designed. And it did. Yes. He studied her for a long moment. And yet I fired you. Allison answered simply. You removed the person asking the questions. She paused, but not the questions themselves. The room remained still. No one interrupted. Jason stood slowly. What happens now? Allison closed her binder. Now the missing information is either produced or the transaction stops. Michael finally spoke again. And if it stops, Allison answered honestly, then it was never safe to begin with. No accusation, no emotion, just conclusion based on evidence. The meeting adjourned without resolution. No signatures, no approvals, no celebration. Only continuation of investigation. As executives left the room, Rebecca walked beside Allison briefly. You knew it would come to this. Allison shook her head. I knew it could. Rebecca looked at her, and Allison paused. He believed speed was the same as success. Rebecca nodded slowly. And now Allison glanced back toward the boardroom where Jason remained inside. Now he's learning the difference. Later that afternoon, Jason sat alone in his office again. This time not staring at deals or timelines, but at the governance document Allison had referenced. The clause he had approved years ago. The clause he had forgotten. The clause that now determined everything. Michael entered quietly. We may still have options. Jason didn't look up. No, Michael frowned. We can restructure authority, Jason interrupted. No. His voice was quieter than usual. Not this time. A long silence followed. Then Jason finally said something he had never said in his entire career as CEO. She was right. Michael didn't respond, because for the first time, even he didn't have a counter-argument. Across the city, Allison closed her final report, not in victory, not in defeat, but in completion of responsibility. Because in her world, the goal was never to win against anyone. It was to ensure the truth survived long enough to be seen. And now, for the first time since the acquisition began, the truth was no longer hidden. It was on the table, waiting. The decision did not come as a dramatic announcement. It came as a scheduled emergency board vote at 8:00 a.m. the following morning, called under Article 14 of the company's governance charter. No press release preceded it. No internal celebration followed. Only a single line circulated through the executive network: governance determination required. Acquisition status review. By the time Jason Nelson entered the boardroom, he already understood what kind of meeting this was. Not an update, not a discussion, a turning point. Margaret Collins was already seated at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Rebecca Hayes sat beside a stack of finalized audit summaries. Ethan Walker appeared via secure video link. 2 independent directors had flown in overnight. And Allison Nelson sat at the far end of the table, calm, composed, unmoving. Jason paused for a fraction of a second when he saw her. Neither of them acknowledged the other immediately, not because of hostility, because the situation had moved beyond personal history. Margaret opened the meeting. This board has received final audit findings, legal analysis, and governance review results. She looked around the room. The purpose of this vote is to determine whether Nelson Dynamics proceeds with the acquisition under current conditions. Jason leaned forward. And what are the options? Margaret answered without hesitation. Proceed, delay, or terminate. Silence followed. The weight of each word was immediate. Proceed meant accepting unresolved risk. Delay meant financial instability. Terminate meant abandoning the largest deal in company history. No option was neutral. Rebecca was the first to present. She stood visibly steady, but serious. The audit committee confirms multiple unresolved financial discrepancies. She clicked the remote. Graphs appeared on screen again. Transaction flows, missing documentation indicators, unverified intermediary structures. We are not alleging fraud, she repeated carefully. We are documenting unresolved financial gaps. One of the independent directors asked, "Could these gaps be administrative errors?" Rebecca didn't hesitate. They could be. A pause. But the pattern is inconsistent with standard acquisition reporting practices. Jason closed his eyes briefly. He already knew what came next. Ethan Walker spoke next. My clients have reviewed all updated materials. He adjusted his posture. They have one requirement. Everyone turned toward him. No transaction will proceed without final legal authorization. Jason exhaled slowly. That clause again. Ethan nodded. It is non-negotiable. He paused. And legally binding under your governance charter. Jason looked toward Allison. For the first time since the process began, he didn't speak with authority. He asked a question. Can it be waived? Allison answered immediately. No. Her voice was calm, not emotional, not defensive. Final. Jason nodded slightly, as if he already knew the answer. Margaret opened the final section, governance review findings. She looked toward Allison. You may proceed. Allison stood. She did not bring multiple binders this time, only one folder. She opened it slowly. I will summarize the final determination. The room became completely silent. Even Rebecca stopped moving. Allison continued. The acquisition cannot be certified as complete under current documentation. She paused. That conclusion is based on 3 factors. She lifted a page. First, incomplete disclosure of requested financial schedules. Another page. Second, unresolved inconsistencies in transaction reporting. Another. Third, failure to reconcile governance-required documentation. She looked up. Individually, each factor requires further review. Collectively, they prevent legal certification. Jason listened without interruption. No anger, no resistance, only absorption. Because for the first time, he understood something that had been unclear for weeks. This was not obstruction. This was structure. Margaret asked a final question. Is there any pathway to completion? Allison nodded once. Yes. Provide complete disclosure. Reconcile missing financial records. Validate intermediary transactions. Then resubmit for certification. One of the directors leaned forward. How long would that take? Allison answered honestly. I don't know. No speculation. Only reality. Silence stretched across the table. Jason finally spoke again. If we do none of that, all eyes turned toward him. Allison answered without hesitation. Then I cannot authorize the transaction. The sentence landed heavier than anything else in the room. Not because it was aggressive, because it was irreversible. Margaret closed her folder. The board will now vote. The room shifted, not physically, but psychologically. Everyone understood what was about to happen. Votes were cast one by one. Delay, delay, delay. Proceed. Delay. Terminate. Delay. When Margaret reached Jason, she did not rush him. She simply asked, "Your vote." Jason looked around the room, at Rebecca, at Ethan, at the independent directors. Finally, he looked at Allison. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Delay. The word did not sound like defeat, but it did not sound like victory either. It sounded like recognition. Reality finally acknowledged. The meeting ended without further discussion. No one celebrated the decision. No one argued, because everyone understood what had just occurred. The acquisition was not canceled, but it was no longer under executive control. It now depended entirely on completion of legal requirements. And the person responsible for those requirements was no longer under Jason's authority. After the room emptied, Jason remained seated. Allison gathered her folder calmly. She prepared to leave without ceremony. As she reached the door, Jason spoke. Allison. She stopped, did not turn immediately. Yes, his voice was lower than usual. Did you ever want this outcome? She turned then, looked at him directly. No. Jason frowned slightly. Then why push it this far? Allison answered without hesitation. Because the alternative was signing something incomplete. She paused, and I was not willing to do that. Jason nodded slowly, not as CEO, not as husband, as someone beginning to understand. I thought you were delaying everything, Allison replied quietly. I was preventing something worse. A long silence followed. Jason finally said, I didn't see it. I know. That was all. No accusation, no comfort, only truth. Outside the boardroom, Rebecca caught up with Allison in the hallway. You okay? Allison adjusted her briefcase. Yes. Rebecca studied her. You just halted a $1 billion deal, Allison corrected gently. I paused it. Rebecca gave a faint, tired smile. That sounds like you. Allison nodded. It's the only responsible description. Rebecca hesitated. Jason finally understands. Allison looked down the corridor where Jason remained inside the boardroom. I think he's starting to. Rebecca exhaled slowly. That must be difficult for him. Allison answered softly. It's difficult for everyone when assumptions break. Meanwhile, inside the boardroom, Jason remained alone. Margaret entered briefly. "You did the right thing." Jason didn't respond immediately. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore." Margaret sat beside him. "You chose delay." "Yes." Why? Jason looked at her. "Because for the first time—" He paused. "I wasn't sure what I was about to approve." Margaret nodded. "That is what good governance is supposed to feel like." Jason gave a quiet, almost bitter smile. It took losing control to realize that. Margaret didn't disagree. Across Manhattan, Allison returned to Hamilton and Pierce. David Hamilton was waiting. "Well, it's delayed." He nodded. "Not stopped, no." "Good." Allison placed her folder on the table. "Now we finish properly." David studied her for a moment. "You know they'll want you back soon." Allison looked out the window. "I know. And I'll decide when the work is complete." David smiled slightly, still not emotional. Allison answered simply, "Emotions don't sign legal certifications." That evening, Jason sat alone in his office again. But this time, he wasn't reviewing deals. He was reviewing something else. Every email Allison had sent, every request, every unanswered question, every missing document. Each one now looked different. Not obstruction, not delay, but warning. He leaned back slowly. For the first time since the acquisition began, he understood something that changed everything. Allison had never been standing in his way. She had been standing between him and a decision that could have destroyed everything he had built. And in doing so, she had lost her position, but not her authority, not her integrity, and not the truth. Outside his window, Manhattan continued moving as if nothing had changed. But inside Nelson Dynamics, everything already had. The weeks that followed the board's decision did not feel like a resolution. They felt like a long, suspended breath no one had fully exhaled yet. Nelson Dynamics continued operating, but nothing moved with its former certainty. Meetings were shorter, decisions were slower, even routine approvals carried an unfamiliar caution. The acquisition had not died, but it was no longer alive in the way Jason Nelson had once imagined. It existed in a state of conditional waiting. Everything now depended on one thing: completion of legal certification, and the only person capable of issuing it was no longer inside the company. Jason did not immediately reach out to Allison again. Not after the board vote. Not after the realization that pressure would not replace missing documentation. Instead, he spent several days reviewing the governance framework alone. Late at night, he sat in his office with the original charter document spread across his desk. Every clause he had once approved with confidence now read differently, especially one section: independent legal certification requirement. He remembered the day it had been added. Allison had insisted on it during a governance overhaul after a failed acquisition years earlier. At the time, Jason had admired her insistence on structure. He had called it protective thinking. Now, he understood what it had really been: a safeguard against exactly this moment. Meanwhile, Allison continued her work at Hamilton and Pierce with no interruption in pace. There were no celebrations, no satisfaction, only continuation. David Hamilton entered her office one afternoon, carrying a final set of compiled documents. "This is everything the forensic team could reconstruct." Allison reviewed the files quietly. "What did they conclude?" David hesitated. "They cannot identify illegality." He paused. "But they also cannot reconcile missing disclosures with standard corporate practice." Allison nodded. "That is consistent." David studied her carefully. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." "Why?" because missing information rarely disappears by accident. David closed the folder, and Jason Allison looked up briefly. What about him? He's been asking about you. She didn't respond immediately. Not because the question was difficult, because the answer was not simple. Finally, she said, "He's asking the wrong question." David frowned slightly. What should he be asking? Allison returned to her notes. Whether the transaction can be completed responsibly. That same afternoon, Jason finally called her again. This time she answered, "Allison, Jason." A pause, not awkward, just heavy. "I need to understand something," Jason said. "All right. Did you ever intend to stop this deal?" There was no hesitation in her voice. "No." Another pause. "Then why does it feel like you did?" Allison answered carefully. "Because stopping and delaying are not the same thing." Jason exhaled slowly. "I thought you were blocking progress. I was blocking incomplete progress. That sounds like the same thing to everyone else. All mistakes sound the same before they are understood." Jason fell silent. For the first time, there was no corporate framing between them. No boardroom, no executives, no authority. Just two people who had built something together long before it became a corporation. "I read the governance clause again," Jason said quietly. "I know, you were right." Allison didn't respond immediately, not out of pride, but because she understood the weight of those words. Eventually, she said, "I wasn't trying to be right. I was trying to be accurate." Jason gave a faint, tired laugh. "That's always been your difference." At Nelson Dynamics, Michael Brooks had become noticeably quieter. Rebecca noticed it first. "You're not pushing timelines anymore." Michael looked up from his desk. "There are no timelines left to push." Rebecca sat across from him. "That's not what you used to say. I used to think speed solved uncertainty." And now Michael leaned back. "Now I think speed sometimes creates it." Rebecca studied him. "Do you think Allison was obstructing us?" Michael hesitated longer than before. "I think," he began, then stopped. Rebecca waited. Finally, he finished. "I think I didn't understand what she was seeing." That was as close to admission as he had ever come. 2 days later, Margaret Collins requested a private meeting with Jason. No executives, no lawyers, just the two of them. They met in a quiet conference room overlooking the river. Margaret placed a single folder on the table. "I want to show you something." Jason opened it. Inside were copies of Allison's original disclosure requests. Each one dated, each one unanswered or partially responded to. Margaret spoke calmly. She asked for this information before any of this escalated. Jason studied the pages. "I know." And she escalated nothing. Jason nodded slowly. "She documented everything." "Yes." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what that means?" Jason looked up. "It means she was building a record. It means she was protecting the company from liability." Margaret corrected gently. "It means she was doing her job." Jason closed the folder. "I didn't see it that way." "No," Margaret said. "You saw urgency. She saw exposure." A long silence followed. Jason finally asked, "Do you think I should bring her back?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was measured. "I think that depends on whether you want speed." She paused. "Or certainty." Jason leaned back. For the first time, he didn't respond immediately, because the answer was no longer obvious. That evening, Jason drove alone through Manhattan. He didn't go home. He ended up outside Hamilton and Pierce. He sat in his car for several minutes before finally getting out. The building was still lit. He entered quietly. David Hamilton met him at the reception desk. "She's still here." Jason nodded. "I'd like to speak with her." David studied him briefly. About the acquisition, Jason shook his head. "About everything I didn't understand." David nodded once. "Then you should speak carefully." Jason didn't respond. He already knew that. Allison was in the conference room reviewing final compiled notes when Jason entered. She looked up, didn't stand immediately. Jason, Allison. A pause. Then he sat across from her. No assistance, no agenda, just silence for a moment. Finally, Jason spoke. "I think I owe you an apology." Allison didn't interrupt. "I thought you were slowing everything down." "I know. I thought you were resisting progress." "I know." Jason looked down at the table. "I didn't realize you were protecting something I couldn't see." Allison closed her notebook gently. "I wasn't protecting something invisible." She paused. "I was protecting what wasn't documented yet." Jason nodded slowly. "That's what I missed." Another silence. Then he asked quietly, "Would you have signed it?" Allison answered immediately, "No." Jason looked up. "Even if I'd asked you personally, yes." "Why?" "Because the missing information still exists." Her voice remained steady. "And I cannot certify what I cannot verify." Jason accepted that answer, not easily, but fully. He stood slowly. "I don't know what happens next." Allison looked at him. "Neither do I. That's never been your answer before. It's the only honest one available." Jason gave a faint, almost sad smile. "You were always more comfortable with uncertainty than I was. I was never comfortable with it." She paused. "I was just trained to respect it." Jason nodded. Then before leaving, he said something he hadn't planned. "I should have listened earlier." Allison didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer. "You didn't have the information yet." Jason stopped at the door. "And now I do." "Yes." "Is it enough?" Allison looked down at her notebook. "No." Jason frowned slightly. "Then what is completion?" Jason left the building quietly. No resolution had been reached. No signature was given. No deal was completed. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, Jason understood that Allison had not removed herself from the company out of conflict. She had stepped out of a system that could no longer support the standards she required. And until that system caught up to the truth she had uncovered, the acquisition would remain exactly where it had stopped. Not failed, not completed, just waiting for something no one could rush: clarity. The final stage of the acquisition did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with silence. 3 weeks after Jason's visit to Hamilton and Pierce Nelson, Dynamics was no longer defined by anticipation of a closing date. The countdown banners in the lobby had been removed. Investor relations stopped referencing near completion. Even internal departments had stopped asking when the deal would finalize. Instead, a new phrase quietly replaced it: pending legal completion. It was not dramatic, but it was absolute. Because everyone inside the company now understood one thing: nothing would move forward without Allison Nelson's certification. Allison did not return to Nelson Dynamics, not immediately. Her work with David Hamilton's team had expanded into a formal independent review of the acquisition's entire disclosure structure. What began as document verification had evolved into a full governance audit. Every file now had to pass through layered validation. Every transaction had to be reconciled with original banking records. Every communication had to be mapped against disclosure timelines. Nothing was assumed. Everything was proven. David once remarked, "This is no longer just due diligence." Allison replied simply, "It never was." Inside Nelson Dynamics, Jason had changed in ways few people could immediately describe. He still held meetings. He still led discussions. He still made decisions, but something fundamental had shifted in how he processed information. He no longer asked, "How fast can we close?" He asked, "What is still missing?" And more importantly, he waited for answers. Rebecca noticed it first. "You're different now," she said during a late financial review. Jason didn't look up. "I had to be." Rebecca hesitated. "Do you regret how this started?" Jason paused. "I regret not understanding the structure sooner." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's not the same thing." "No," Jason admitted quietly. "It isn't." Meanwhile, Michael Brooks had been reassigned to operational oversight under restricted executive authority pending internal review. He no longer attended strategic acquisition meetings. He no longer influenced legal coordination. For the first time in years, Michael found himself in a position where speed alone no longer mattered. One afternoon, Rebecca found him reviewing old communication logs. "You're trying to understand it," she said. Michael didn't look up. "I thought I was coordinating progress." Rebecca sat across from him. "And now I think I was coordinating assumptions." That sentence lingered. Rebecca didn't argue, because even she had begun to understand how easily assumptions had shaped the company's direction. At Hamilton and Pierce, Allison completed the final reconciliation report. It was not short. It was not simple. It contained hundreds of pages of verified financial flows, corrected disclosure gaps, and reconstructed transaction timelines. David Hamilton reviewed the final summary and leaned back. "This is stronger than most federal audit files I've seen." Allison closed her notebook. "It only works because nothing is missing anymore." Laura Mitchell added, "Which is exactly why it took this long." Benjamin Ortiz nodded. "Completeness is rarely fast." Allison didn't respond. She understood that better than anyone. The final board meeting was scheduled without fanfare. No media presence, no investor announcements, no ceremonial tone, only a formal resolution. Final governance certification review, acquisition of Northbridge Systems. Jason entered the boardroom last. He did not sit at the head of the table immediately. Instead, he looked at the empty seat where Allison had once always sat during early-stage meetings. This time, she was present again, not as General Counsel of Nelson Dynamics, but as independent certifying legal authority. The room was different now. Quieter, heavier, more precise. Margaret Collins opened the session. "This meeting will determine whether the acquisition is legally certifiable." She looked toward Allison. "You may proceed." Allison stood. She placed only one folder on the table. No theatrics, no build-up, just finality. "I will present the certification conclusion." She paused, then continued. "The acquisition is now compliant with governance requirements." A shift moved through the room. "Not celebration, resolution," she continued. "All previously identified disclosure gaps have been resolved. All financial transaction flows have been reconciled. All intermediary structures have been verified and documented." She closed the folder. "Based on completed review, I can certify the transaction." Silence followed. Not because anyone was confused, but because everyone understood what that meant. The deal could now proceed. Legally, ethically, structurally. Jason finally spoke. "So it's done." Allison looked at him. "Yes." Rebecca exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for months. Ethan Walker nodded from the screen. "Then my clients will proceed with closing authorization." Margaret closed her notes. "The board concurs." The vote was no longer necessary. Certainty had replaced speculation. After the meeting ended, the room slowly emptied. Rebecca paused beside Allison. You didn't have to go this far, she said softly. Allison shook her head. Yes, I did. Rebecca smiled faintly. That's what makes you different, Allison answered simply. It's what makes the documents reliable. Rebecca nodded, then walked out. Jason remained behind. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, I understand now. Allison looked at him. Understand what? That you weren't slowing the deal. He paused. You were defining its boundaries. Allison didn't respond immediately. Then she said, boundaries only matter when pressure exists. Jason gave a small, tired smile. There was a lot of pressure. There always is. Silence followed. Then Jason asked quietly, would you do it differently next time? Allison considered the question carefully. No, Jason nodded. I didn't think you would. Another pause. Then he added, I think I confused trust with speed. Allison replied, they are not the same. Jason looked down. I know that now. He stood slowly. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. They won't. I also don't expect things to stay the same. Allison nodded. They shouldn't. Jason looked at her one final time. You saved this company from something I couldn't see, Allison corrected gently. I made sure you could see it before deciding. Jason exhaled. That's worse. Not worse, she said. Slower. That earned a faint smile from him. A real one this time. Outside Manhattan continued moving as it always did. Unaware of boardrooms, unaware of signatures, unaware of decisions that shifted billions of dollars in seconds. Inside Nelson Dynamics, however, something had changed permanently. The company would close the acquisition. But not because it was fast, because it was finally complete, and Allison Nelson walked away once again, not as someone removed from power, but as the person who had defined what responsible power actually meant. Without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, without needing approval, just truth, fully documented, fully verified, fully signed.